Night. The year is 612 BC, and one of the largest and most powerful cities of the ancient world is burning. Its name is Nineveh. For generations it has been the ceremonial heart of an empire that dominates much of the Near East, a city its own kings called the city without rival. Its defenses are monumental, built to project the same confidence as the empire behind them. Its palaces are lined with carved stone, room after room of lions and armies and gods. Its library holds tens of thousands of clay tablets, the accumulated memory of 3,000 years of human thought. And on this night, all of it is on fire. A coalition of Babylonians and Medes has broken through. After a siege of 3 months, the gates are down, the temples are burning, the statues of the gods are being smashed or dragged away into the dark. Somewhere within the collapsing royal quarter, the Assyrian king may be making his last stand. Whatever his exact fate, the imperial center that once commanded lands from the Iranian highlands to Egypt is being destroyed with astonishing speed. Within generations, damaged palaces will lie beneath debris and wind-blown soil, while political memory shifts to the powers that replaced Assyria. The prophet Nahum will write of Nineveh in words dripping with hatred, calling it a city of blood, and the world will nod and move on. This is the image we carry when we think of the ancient past, the mighty city, the final fire, the fall. We have been telling this story for as long as we have been telling stories. The great civilization rises, grows proud, grows soft, grows blind. And then one night, the barbarians come over the walls, and the lights go out forever. It is a satisfying story. It has a clear beginning and a clear, tragic end. It fits neatly into a few minutes of narration, a few dramatic images, a convenient villain, and a single final flame. There is only one problem with it. For the land where Nineveh burned, it is not true. Because Nineveh was not the beginning of Mesopotamia's story, and it was not the end. It was somewhere in the middle, and the burning of that impossible city was not the first time this land had watched its greatest power collapse into ash. It was one episode in a much older sequence of imperial breakdowns and recoveries. Long before Assyria, the rulers of Akkad had created one of the earliest territorial empires known to history, and it had fallen. Long before that empire, there had been cities so old that when the empire's own scribes dug into the ground, they found ruins beneath their ruins. After the empire fell, a brilliant renaissance rose in its place, and that fell too. Then came the age of Babylon and its famous lawgiver, and a golden age that everyone agreed would last forever, and that shattered. Then came the upheavals at the end of the Bronze Age, when kingdoms across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East failed, contracted, or transformed within the same troubled era, and Mesopotamia was drawn into that crisis as well. Yet after every political rupture, urban life, scribal culture, and kingship returned in a new form. That is the part the story never tells you. The land between the two rivers did not fall once. Across roughly 3,000 years, its major states repeatedly fractured, contracted, or disappeared. Cities were abandoned, empires were annihilated, populations starved and scattered, kings were dragged in chains into exile, political centers failed repeatedly, sometimes with devastating human consequences. And every time the lights went out, someone, somewhere, in that same stretch of mud and reeds and floodwater, reached down into the wreckage and lit them again. So here is the question this film is going to ask. Not the easy question, the one everyone else asks. Not why did Mesopotamia fall? The real question is stranger and much harder. Why wouldn't it stay dead? What was it about this hot, open, resource-poor floodplain, a land short of stone, metal, and timber, and exposed to shifting rivers, drought, conflict, and the slow accumulation of salt, that repeatedly generated fragile states, yet made the culture beneath those states so difficult to erase? To answer that, we are going to change the scale of the usual story. We are going to stop treating the fall as a single event and examine a recurring sequence: concentration, strain, breakdown, adaptation, and renewal. Across 30 centuries, that sequence becomes more revealing than any one ruined capital. And along the way, we are going to take apart the comfortable explanations, the ones you have heard before, the ones that fit in a single sentence. The drought did it. The salt did it. The barbarians did it. Because when you actually look, when you get down into the clay tablets and the crop records and the layers of abandoned earth, you find that no single cause is sufficient on its own. The truth is more unsettling than any of them. Outside enemies mattered, but they rarely acted alone. Again and again, political systems created dependencies that magnified drought, soil stress, succession disputes, fiscal pressure, migration, and war. Collapse was not inevitable, but the way these states concentrated food, labor, authority, and risk made certain crises far harder to absorb. But if that were the whole story, this would just be a tragedy, repeated across repeated crises. And it isn't, because woven through every collapse is that other, stranger thread, the refusal, the thing that would not die. By the time we return to Nineveh burning in the dark, you are going to understand that fire completely differently. You are going to see that it was not an ending at all. It was a transfer. Because even as Nineveh burned, 300 miles to the south, in a city that had spent centuries in the shadow of empires, in a city everyone had counted out, priests were still tending an old shrine, and a new king was already sharpening his ambition, and another extraordinary political and cultural revival was already beginning. This is the story of a civilization whose empires repeatedly collapsed, while its deepest institutions continued to survive, and repeatedly found a way to begin again. Let's begin where everything began. Not with a king, not with a war, not even with a city. Let's begin with water. To understand why a civilization keeps dying, you have to understand how it was born. And the emergence of urban life in southern Mesopotamia can look improbable, because the landscape offered abundance only to people capable of organizing water on a large scale. Look at a map of the ancient Near East, and your eye is drawn to the wrong places. It goes to the green coastlines, the rain-fed hills, the river valleys of the north, where wild wheat grew on its own, and the first farmers scratched out their first fields. Those places make sense. Those are the places you would choose to build a civilization. Yet the southern alluvium became one of the places where urban civilization developed earliest and most dramatically. The southern floodplain of the Tigris and Euphrates, in what is now southern Iraq, is a hard land. It is flat, almost unnaturally flat, a vast tabletop of dried silt stretching to the horizon. Summer heat can be extreme. It gets almost no rain, sometimes only a few inches a year, nowhere near enough to grow a crop. It has no stone to build with, no metal ore in the ground, no forests for timber, no mountains or coastline to hide behind when enemies come. On the surface, it appears to offer little of what later monumental societies would need. But this land had a secret, and the secret was buried in the mud. The two great rivers rose and shifted with water descending from the north, but their behavior was not as simple or predictable as a calendar. They came down out of the highlands of what is now Turkey, swollen with mountain snowmelt, and they spilled across that flat plain and dumped their cargo, a rich, dark, fertile silt, the pulverized soil of an entire mountain range, spread out fresh across the fields. If you could get water to that silt at the right time, in the right amount, it would grow almost anything. Barley, wheat, dates, legumes. It would grow them not just in survivable amounts, but in staggering, ridiculous surplus. Land that looked like desert could, with the right coaxing, become exceptionally productive farmland. But notice the condition hidden inside that promise: if you could get water to it. Because the rivers did not flood when the crops needed water. Their high water could arrive late in the growing cycle, while the hottest months brought a very different problem. Fields needed controlled access to water when natural flow and local channels could not be trusted to deliver it evenly. The water was there. It was just there at the wrong time, in the wrong place, in the wrong amount. So the people of the southern plain did the thing that would define everything that came after. They took control of the water themselves. They dug channels. They cut canals to lead the river out to the fields. They built levees to hold the floods back, and basins to store water for the dry months, and gates to let it out again when the crop was thirsty. They took a river that flooded on its own schedule and bent it to a human schedule. This is the moment when a powerful but demanding system began to take shape, because that system, those canals and levees and gates, was not something you could build once and walk away from. It required maintenance in every generation. Canals silt up. Silt had to be cleared by coordinated labor. Levees breach. Floods have to be predicted and managed. Water has to be shared, fairly enough that upstream farmers don't simply take it all and let the downstream ones die. And every one of those tasks required something that a village of independent families simply cannot produce on its own. It required organization. It required someone to say, you dig here, you carry there, this water goes to that field on that day. It required leadership and record-keeping, and the authority to make people work together on projects far larger than any single family could ever attempt. And so, out of the mud and the water and the desperate need to manage them, the entire apparatus of civilization began to assemble itself, almost as a side effect. Temple institutions stored and redistributed goods, legitimized communal obligations, and linked economic coordination to the service of the gods. Scribes tracked obligations, labor, livestock, and grain, helping early accounting practices develop into one of the world's oldest writing traditions. The manager, the priest-king, the big man, who organized the labor and settled the disputes, and, in a crisis, led the defense. The specialist, the potter and the weaver and the metalworker, who could exist at all only because the surplus was so vast that not everyone had to farm. This is the great engine of early cities. Surplus creates specialists. Specialists create complexity. Complexity requires management. Management concentrates power. Power builds bigger systems. Bigger systems produce bigger surplus. Round and round the wheel turns, faster and faster, and in the span of just a few centuries, a scatter of mud villages becomes Uruk, a true city of tens of thousands of people, ruled by kings, watched over by temple towers that scrape the sky, humming with trade and craft and law and story. One of the earliest large cities yet known, and a formative model for urban life in the region. It is a triumph. It is one of the defining achievements of early human history. And it is a trap. Because here is the thing that the celebration of early cities always leaves out, and it is one of the central ideas in this film, so hold on to it. Many of the same arrangements that created extraordinary productive power also created concentrated dependencies. Strength and vulnerability grew from the same institutions, although not always in the same measure or at the same time. Think about what these cities actually were. They were dense concentrations of people who did not grow their own food. A potter does not farm. A scribe does not farm. A priest, a soldier, a weaver, a king, none of them farm. They eat because farmers working a managed landscape produce enough surplus to support people whose labor is no longer devoted mainly to food production. The entire glittering structure, the temples and the palaces and the writing and the law, all of it balances on top of one thing: the reliable flow of surplus grain out of an irrigated field. Sever that flow for long enough, and the systems above it begin to fail. And that thread was thin. It depended on the canals staying clear, which depended on organized labor, which depended on political stability. It depended on the rivers behaving, which depended on rainfall in mountains hundreds of miles away that no Mesopotamian could see or control. It depended on the soil staying fertile, which, as we will see in horrifying detail, was quietly being poisoned by the very irrigation that made it productive in the first place. It depended on the fields not being trampled by war, which in a land of competing cities crammed together on the same plain, all fighting over the same water, was a constant, grinding threat. A small farming community can, in some circumstances, be less exposed to failures in taxation, court politics, or long-distance supply than a palace-centered state. Its resilience is local rather than absolute. Leaders may change while household production continues, and damage in one place does not necessarily disable an entire administrative network. A complex urban state works differently. It is an intricate network whose institutions, roads, canals, archives, markets, fields, and chains of command depend on one another. It can do things no simple society could ever dream of, and it can be brought down by the failure of any one of its critical systems. The more advanced it is, the more moving parts it has, and the more ways there are for it to break. This is the deep truth underneath every collapse in this story. Mesopotamia did not keep falling because its people were foolish, or weak, or unlucky. Its recurring crises cannot be separated from the ambitious scale of what its people built. Each new state could coordinate more people and resources than the one before it. But coordination also created new points of pressure. Expansion increased capacity. It also increased the cost of failure. The relationship was not automatic, yet it recurs often enough to become one of the central patterns of this history. One more feature of the landscape helps explain why political unity was so difficult to sustain. The rivers themselves conspired against unity. It is tempting to assume that two great rivers would bind the region together as neatly as the Nile is often said to have bound Egypt. But even Egypt's history was neither uniformly stable nor governed by geography alone. The Nile Valley, nevertheless, offered a narrower agricultural corridor and a different pattern of communication, while the lower Tigris and Euphrates formed shifting, branching waterways that were harder for any one center to command. But the Tigris and Euphrates are not the Nile. Down on the southern plain they do not run as two clean lines. They split, they braid, they wander, they break into a maze of smaller channels and marshes and shifting waterways, a web rather than a highway. And that meant that no single city, no single ruler, could ever easily control all the water. One city could dam a channel and choke the city downstream. Another could divert a canal and flourish while its neighbor withered. The geography itself made the cities into rivals, each one clutching its own stretch of water, each one able to hurt the others, none of them able to permanently dominate the rest. Mesopotamian political life therefore developed with a persistent tension between shared culture and divided authority. A shared culture, a shared language, a shared set of gods, a shared way of life, spread across a plain of independent, competing, endlessly warring city-states, each one convinced of its own importance, each one guarding its own water, each one ready to cut its neighbor's throat over a boundary canal. Here, then, is the structural problem in its earliest form. A civilization of astonishing achievement, standing on a single, fragile pillar of irrigated surplus. A landscape that punished cooperation with the constant temptation to compete. A soil that fed millions while slowly poisoning itself. A dependence on distant rains that no one could predict or control. And a complexity so great that the failure of any single system, the canal, the harvest, the peace, the climate, could bring the whole tower crashing down. It is a system of remarkable human ingenuity, built to generate abundance, but never free from the risks created by maintenance, competition, and environmental change. Now watch it run. Because the first person to look at that plain of squabbling city-states and imagine welding them all into a single empire is about to appear. He will become one of the most consequential rulers of the early ancient Near East. He will take this divided urban world and push territorial rule to a scale rarely attempted before. He will build an imperial order of unusual scale, and he will make it look, for a few dazzling generations, unstoppable, eternal, invincible. His name is Sargon, and the empire he builds is going to be one of the first great imperial systems this land creates. It will also become the first major imperial system in this story to disintegrate. Before we watch the Akkadian Empire fail, you need to understand how old the urban and religious traditions of this region already were when Sargon appeared. Their depth is one major reason political collapse did not erase Mesopotamian civilization. By the time the first empire in our story broke apart, cities, temples, crafts, rituals, stories, and administrative practices had already accumulated across many centuries. A dynasty could be cut down quickly. A cultural root system spread across many communities was harder to remove. Let me try to make that depth real for you, because it is almost impossible to feel. When the scribes of a much later empire dug into the ground beneath their own cities, they found ruins, and beneath those ruins, older ruins, and beneath those, older still. There is a story that when the last king of Babylon, in the 6th century BC, wanted to date some ancient foundations his workmen had uncovered, his scholars guessed, and they were wrong, by 1500 years. 1500 years. That is the gap between us and the fall of Rome, and it was merely the size of their error about their own past. This was a civilization so old that its own people, standing among its monuments, could not correctly imagine how old it was. It began, as we have seen, with water and mud and the first villages. One of the earliest sacred urban centers in the southern tradition has a name, Eridu. Founded on the edge of a marsh near the Gulf in the far south, with occupation reaching back into the 6th millennium BC, Eridu was so ancient that the later Mesopotamians themselves regarded it as almost mythical, the first city of all. Their sacred king list, which recorded the rulers of the land stretching back into the mists, opened with a line that still gives you chills to read. It said that after kingship first descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. This was the beginning of the world, as they understood it. And a later poem describes the moment of creation itself, in terms any Mesopotamian would feel in their bones. It says that no reed had yet grown, no tree had been made, no house had been built, no city had been built. All the lands were sea, and then Eridu was made. In later memory, it became the first city and the beginning of ordered human life. This is how deep the roots go. The people of this land located the birth of the world itself in one of their own oldest cities. And that king list, the record in rulers stretching back to the dawn, contains one of the strangest and most wonderful details in the ancient world. A detail that tells you exactly how these people thought about the depth of time. The earliest kings on the list, the ones from before a great flood, are said to have reigned not for years or decades, but for tens of thousands of years each. One king of Eridu is recorded as ruling for 28,800 years, his successor 36,000. Two kings, a combined 64,000 years in the first city alone. These are not real reigns, of course. No one lived 36,000 years, but that is not the point. The point is what the numbers mean. They are the ancient world's way of saying, This is old beyond imagining. This is old beyond counting. The beginning is so far back that ordinary numbers fail, and we must reach for the impossible ones. When a people writes its own origins in units of 30,000-year reigns, it is telling you that its roots run down past the floor of memory itself. Then came Uruk, and with Uruk, the roots became a mighty trunk. We have already met Uruk as one of the major centers in the early development of writing, but stand in it for a moment as it was, around 3,500 years before Christ, and feel what it meant. It was among the largest urban settlements yet created, perhaps home to tens of thousands of people, an extraordinary concentration of humanity for its age. It sprawled across the plain behind massive walls. At its heart rose two great temple districts, one dedicated to the sky god, one to the goddess of love and war, their platforms lifting the shrines toward heaven, the direct ancestors of the ziggurats to come. Its streets hummed with potters and weavers and metalworkers and merchants and scribes and priests, an early and unusually large system of urban specialization operating at remarkable scale. Uruk was so influential, its ways of building and writing and organizing spread so far across the ancient Near East that archaeologists speak of an entire Uruk expansion, a period in which Uruk-related material culture, institutions, and exchange networks spread widely across the Near East. Many later Mesopotamian cities inherited institutions, technologies, and symbolic forms first developed or transformed on a grand scale here, and Uruk gave later scribes one of humanity's earliest surviving literary heroes and one of its most enduring stories, in the person of a king who may or may not have truly lived and who became, in memory, larger than any mere man. Gilgamesh. The king list places him at Uruk in the early 3rd millennium, and whether he was a real ruler dressed in myth or a myth given a throne, it hardly matters, because what he became is one of the most enduring meditations on friendship, grief, mortality, and kingship in ancient literature. The great epic that bears his name, though it was compiled into its classic form centuries after his supposed reign, drew on tales already ancient, and it made of this king of Uruk a figure who is part god and part man, powerful and arrogant and restless, who finds a beloved friend and then loses him to death and is broken open by that grief, and who sets out on a doomed journey to escape death itself. He is one of the earliest literary heroes whose story survives in writing. His story, rooted in one of the oldest urban traditions, confronts a problem shared across human experience: mortality. We will return to Gilgamesh at the very end, because his refusal to accept death and his final, hard-won wisdom about it is, in a way, the whole story of this land in miniature. And these cities, Eridu and Uruk and the others, Ur and Lagash and Kish and Nippur and Umma, did not stand alone. They formed a world, the Sumerian world, dozens of independent city-states sharing a language, a religion, a way of life, and a ferocious, unending rivalry. Each had its own patron god, its own king, its own fields, its own stretch of precious water, and, exactly as the geography demanded, they fought. They fought over boundaries, over canals, over the endless question of who controlled the flow of the water that meant life or death. We have their war monuments, carved stone slabs showing kings leading ranked soldiers in helmets over the trampled bodies of their enemies, some of the earliest surviving depictions of organized warfare. This was the world before the empires, a brilliant, quarrelsome, creative, violent constellation of cities, each one a jewel, none of them able to master the rest, for 1,000 years and more. And how rich, how deep, how astonishing that world already was. We know from a discovery that stunned the modern world when it was made. In the royal cemetery of Ur, archaeologists uncovered graves from around the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, before Sargon, before the Akkadian Empire, that revealed a civilization of almost unbelievable wealth and sophistication, and of almost unbelievable strangeness. There was gold, worked with exquisite skill, and lapis lazuli, carried from Afghanistan, and carnelian from the Indus, and silver and bronze, and the finest craftsmanship the ancient world could produce. There were musical instruments, great lyres, inlaid with shell and gold, their sound boxes crowned with the heads of bulls. There were the graves of kings and of queens, one of them named Puabi, buried with a headdress of gold leaves so delicate it looks like it might still stir in a breeze. And there was something darker, something that reaches across the millennia and grips you by the throat, because the kings and queens of Ur did not go into the earth alone. In the great death pits of the royal cemetery lay the bodies of dozens of attendants, soldiers and servants and musicians and grooms, arranged in careful rows, who appear to have gone down into the tomb with their ruler and died there, to serve them in the world beyond. Guards with their weapons, women in their finest jewelry, musicians, some of them with their hands still near their instruments, as if the music had been playing as the darkness came. An entire court, following its master and mistress into death. We do not fully understand it. We do not know if they went willingly, drugged into a final sleep, or in terror. But we know it happened, and it tells us that this civilization, 1,000 years before Nineveh, before the Akkadian Empire even existed, was already a world of immense wealth, artistry, hierarchy, and unsettling ritual belief, a world with a full and terrible imagination of death and what might lie beyond it. This is the depth of the roots. By the time Sargon appeared to build an early territorial empire, this civilization was already, by any reasonable measure, many centuries old as an urban tradition, with cities and temples whose earliest phases predated Egypt's Great Pyramids, a written language, a rich literature, a hero legend, a pantheon of gods, law and mathematics and astronomy in their infancy, and a memory of its own beginnings that stretched back so far its own people could only describe it in reigns of 30,000 years. When we say this civilization refused to die, this is why. You were never trying to kill a young thing. You were looking at a tradition whose roots already extended through many centuries of settlement, ritual, and urban experimentation. You could burn its cities. You could topple its empires. But the roots extended deep into accumulated practice and memory, and roots that deep can survive even when the political structures above them are cut down. Now, at last, we can watch the Akkadian Empire rise from that ancient ground, and we can watch it fall. But keep the depth of these roots in your mind as you do, because it is a central part of the answer. Every time the tree above the ground was cut down or burned, the roots were still there, and from roots this old and this deep, something repeatedly grew back. Before the chronology begins, one distinction matters. Akkad did not collapse everywhere at the same moment, and the word collapse can hide regional differences. Administrative control weakened unevenly. Some northern settlements contracted or were abandoned, while communities farther south continued to farm, trade, worship, and write. What died was not Mesopotamian life. What failed was a particular imperial arrangement, the ability of one dynasty to command distant cities, extract resources, suppress rivals, and reproduce authority after each succession. That is the level on which this arc uses the word collapse. Sometime around 2300 BC, a man who would call himself Sargon walked out of obscurity and into history, and the political possibilities of this land changed. We do not really know where he came from. That, it turns out, is the point. The legends that survive about him, written down centuries after his death by people who worshipped his memory, tell a story that should sound familiar. They say his mother was a priestess who could not keep him. They say she laid him in a basket of reeds, sealed it with tar, and set it adrift on the river. They say he was pulled from the water by a humble man, a drawer of water, and raised as a gardener's son, a baby in a basket on the river, rescued and raised to greatness. If that reminds you of the story of Moses, it should. The biblical Moses tradition belongs to a much later textual world, although the dating and relationship of these traditions remain debated. The resemblance is striking, but chronology is not simple. The Sargon legend survives in much later copies, and similarity alone does not prove that one tradition directly borrowed from the other. Whether any of it is true almost doesn't matter, because the legend tells you exactly what these people believed a great king should be. He should come from nowhere. He should owe his throne to no bloodline, no inheritance, no ancient right, but to his own overwhelming ability and the favor of the gods. Sargon was, above all, a self-made man, and in a world of hereditary priest-kings clutching their inherited estates, that made him something genuinely new and genuinely dangerous. He began his career, the stories say, as a cupbearer, a personal servant, to the king of the city of Kish. It was a position close to power, without being power, and Sargon used it. When the moment came, he seized the throne of Kish for himself, and then he attempted something no ruler had yet sustained on the same scale. He looked south, at the ancient, proud, endlessly feuding city-states of Sumer, the oldest cities on earth, each one guarding its own gods and its own water and its own 1,000-year history, and he decided he would take them all. At that moment, the most powerful man in the south was a king named Lugal-Zaggisi, who had briefly bullied many of the Sumerian cities into a loose alliance under his own rule. He was the establishment. He was the man everyone feared. And Sargon marched on him, defeated him in battle, and, in a gesture heavy with meaning, dragged him in a neck-stock to the holy city of Nippur, and paraded him before the temple of the chief god. The message could not have been clearer. The old order was broken. The gods had chosen someone new. But defeating one rival king was not what made Sargon revolutionary. Conquerors had come and gone before. What Sargon did next was unusual in scale and durability, and it is the reason his name was still spoken with awe 2,000 years after his death. He did not do what every previous conqueror had done, which was to defeat a city, extract tribute, install a puppet from the local dynasty, and move on, leaving the old structures in place. Sargon understood that this was why every previous empire had lasted about as long as the strong man at the top. The moment the conqueror weakened, the old local families reasserted themselves, and it all fell apart. So Sargon tore the old structures out by the roots. He removed the local rulers. He removed the entrenched priestly families who had controlled the temple estates, the richest land in each city, for 1,000 years. And he replaced them with his own men, Akkadian officials, often members of his own family, personally loyal to him and him alone, planted in every conquered city as governors. He maintained a royal military establishment whose dependents, in the memorable language of later tradition, ate bread before the king, forces loyal not to any city, but to Sargon personally. He made his own language, Akkadian, the official language of administration across the whole realm. He standardized weights and measures so that trade and taxation could flow smoothly from one end of his territory to the other. He was not merely defeating cities, he was helping establish an early and influential model of territorial empire. The multi-ethnic, centrally administered, professionally garrisoned, bureaucratically unified state. He was developing practices such as provincial control, royal appointments, military force, standardized administration, and imperial ideology, all of which later, Near Eastern empires would adapt in different ways. When later kings, 1,000 years in the future, wanted to sound legitimate and grand, they called themselves King of Akkad, Sargon's title, long after Akkad itself had crumbled into dust. And the empire he built was, for a time, magnificent. His conquests, or those of his successors, reached from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, and possibly beyond. Trade routes that had once been broken among a dozen suspicious little kingdoms now ran unbroken across the whole ancient world under a single authority. Cedar came down from the mountains of Lebanon. Copper and diorite came across the Gulf from Oman. Lapis lazuli, that impossibly blue stone, came all the way from Afghanistan. Carnelian came from the Indus Valley in what is now Pakistan. Under Akkadian rule, merchants and officials could, on a scale rarely achieved before, deal directly with the trader lords of distant Iran and the far edges of the known world. The wealth of half a continent flowed into Sargon's new capital, a city called Akkad, so rich and so famous that its name became a byword for imperial splendor. And here is a strange and haunting fact. That city, Akkad, the capital of one of the world's earliest territorial empires, and a city of enormous historical importance, has never been found. Archaeologists know roughly where it was. They have searched for it for over a century, and it remains lost, buried somewhere under the shifting silt of Iraq, waiting. The capital of this early empire is a city we have completely lost track of. Somewhere out there, it is still waiting to be found. Sargon ruled, the later king lists claim, for 56 years. When he finally died, apparently of old age, he left behind a transformed world. The independent city-states had not disappeared, but the political horizon had changed. Territorial empire had become a durable possibility. But listen closely to what happened the moment he died, because it tells you everything about what he had really built. The moment Sargon died, the empire caught fire. Rebellion after rebellion broke out. The proud old cities of Sumer, which had never truly accepted their new Akkadian masters, rose up. Sargon's son Rimush inherited the throne and spent his reign drowning revolts in blood. By his own boastful account, he tore down the walls of rebellious cities, slaughtered thousands of soldiers, sold thousands more into slavery, and drove yet more thousands into what can only be described as forced labor camps, where the records tell us they worked and died. He was a brutal, effective, terrifying ruler. And after only about 9 years, he was murdered. Not on a battlefield, in a back room of his own palace, assassinated, according to one grim tradition, by his own courtiers, who strangled him with their heavy cylinder seals, the little stone stamps every official carried. The most powerful man in the world, killed with office supplies. His brother took the throne, ruled a few years, and was also murdered. Do you see the pattern already forming? This is the shadow side of Sargon's genius. He had built an empire held together entirely by his own personal loyalty network and his own overwhelming force of personality. He had smashed the old local structures, but he had not replaced them with anything that could survive without a strong man at the top. Every succession was a crisis. Every weak moment was an invitation to rebellion. The empire was not a stable structure. It was a spinning top, and it stayed upright only as long as someone kept it spinning at full speed. For a while, someone did. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, seized the throne and turned out to be perhaps the most capable of them all. He crushed the greatest rebellion the empire had yet seen, a revolt so large that most of the cities of the realm rose against him at once. And by his own account, it took at least 9 separate battles to put it down. He expanded the empire to its greatest extent. He was a brilliant, ferocious warrior king. And then, Naram-Sin did something that no Mesopotamian ruler had ever dared to do. He declared himself a god, not a servant of the gods, not a chosen agent of the gods. A god, living, walking among men. He had his name written with the special mark reserved for deities. He had himself depicted wearing the horned crown, that only gods were allowed to wear, standing taller than his soldiers, striding up a mountain over the bodies of his enemies toward the sun and stars. The living king as a living god. It was the ultimate expression of imperial power, and it was, in the eyes of later generations, the ultimate act of pride. Because it was under Naram-Sin, or in the generations immediately after him, that the Akkadian imperial system began to disintegrate. And now we come to the heart of this arc, and to the first great lesson of this entire film. Because the way the empire died has been explained, over and over, in a single simple sentence, and that single simple sentence is a lie. Or at least, it is so incomplete that it hides the real truth entirely. Here is the simple version, the one you have heard, the one every documentary repeats. Around 2200 BC, a catastrophic drought struck the Near East. The crops failed. Barbarians called the Gutians came down out of the mountains, and the Akkadian Empire collapsed. Drought plus barbarians equals fall. One sentence. Done. Now here is what actually happened, and it is far more interesting and far more disturbing. The drought was real. Modern climate science has confirmed it in extraordinary detail. Around 2200 BC, a massive, abrupt shift in the climate struck a huge swath of the ancient world all at once. A period scientists now call the 4.2 kiloyear event, and it was so significant that it became important enough to influence modern discussions about subdivisions of the Holocene, although both its timing and its regional effects remain subjects of debate. It brought sudden, sustained aridity from the Mediterranean to South Asia. It has been blamed for the collapse of Old Kingdom Egypt, the disruption of the Indus Valley civilization, and the fall of Akkad, all in roughly the same terrible window. In the far north of the Akkadian world, in the rain-fed agricultural zone that fed the empire's grain, the effect was devastating. At the great city of Tel Leilan, the archaeological record is brutal and vivid. The animals died, their skeletons found thin and starved, and then the people simply left. Many thousands appear to have left the settlement, although estimates of the population and the pace of abandonment vary. Walking away from a dying land, in search of water somewhere, anywhere else. 100 miles away, the city of Tel Brak shrank to a quarter of its former size, and into the vacuum left by the retreating empire, nomadic peoples from the western deserts began to drift, seeping into the abandoned lands. So the drought was real, and it was catastrophic. Case closed? No. Because here is the question the simple story never asks. Droughts happen. This region had endured dry years and bad harvests for thousands of years before Akkad, and would endure them for thousands of years after. Why did this drought bring down an entire empire, when others merely caused hardship? And the answer that modern researchers keep circling back to, is that the drought did not act on a society free of other pressures. It acted on a society that had already stretched itself to the breaking point. Think back to the dependencies described in the last arc. Sargon and his heirs extended systems of extraction, military command and administration, across a territory rarely governed from one center before. They had built an empire that depended on extracting grain from every corner of the realm, on constant campaigns, on a swollen administration, on cities packed with people who did not grow their own food. To support that expanding order, they relied heavily on production from vulnerable and marginal zones, drier lands with a higher risk of failure, precisely the zones the drought would hit first and hardest. The empire had grown, in the careful words of one recent analysis, through a kind of unsustainable overshoot, a growth so rapid and so extended that it might well have become unsustainable, even if the climate had never changed at all. In other words, the empire was already carrying risks created by rapid expansion. The drought was not a complete explanation. It was a severe stress, acting on an imperial system already carrying military, fiscal, demographic, and logistical burdens. And there is something even more damning than that, something that lifts this out of the realm of natural disaster and into the realm of human failure. Because the deeper you look, the more it seems that the fatal weakness was not the climate at all. It was how the people in charge responded to the climate. The system had warning signs: failing harvests, emptying cities, retreating frontiers, and imperial institutions, organized around expectations of continued production, could not, or would not, absorb the fact that the ground had shifted beneath it. It kept treating a permanent transformation as if it were a temporary bad patch. It kept demanding the same grain, the same labor, the same tribute, from a landscape that could no longer provide it. Climate stress altered the conditions under which the state operated. Governance, extraction, conflict, and the ability or inability to adapt helped determine whether that stress became disruption, regional abandonment, or imperial breakdown. Even the Gutians, the barbarians who supposedly delivered the final blow, looked different under this light. Later Mesopotamian literature loved to blame them. There is a famous poem, The Curse of Akkad, that tells the whole story as a morality tale. It says that the god Enlil withdrew his favor from the city, that Naram-Sin, in his rage, attacked the god's own holy temple, and that in punishment, the god sent the Gutians and famine to destroy Akkad forever. It is a powerful story. It is also almost entirely fiction. The real Naram-Sin was, as far as we can tell, a pious king who lavishly rebuilt that very temple. The poem was written generations later by people who needed the fall of the greatest empire in history to mean something, to be a punishment for pride, rather than the messy, structural, half-accidental thing it actually was. That is the unsettling part. No single cause can carry the whole explanation. Not the drought alone, not the Gutians alone, not the pride of one god-king alone. There was an overextended imperial order, a major environmental shock, political resistance, opportunism at the frontiers, and institutions that struggled to adjust. Their interaction matters more than any one factor isolated from the rest. One of the world's earliest territorial empires, the template for everything that would follow, the creation of a king remembered for millennia, collapsed. The lost capital fell silent. The Gutians ruled parts of the land, badly, for a while, remembered in the texts as a people who knew no restraint, the dragon of the mountains. The cities went quiet, and a darkness, a dry, hungry, broken darkness, settled over the land between the rivers. The first great thing this civilization ever built was gone. And this is exactly the moment where every other version of the story would put a full stop. The empire fell. The end. Roll the credits on the tragedy. But we are not going to stop here, because something is about to happen in that broken, silent land that changes the entire meaning of the word collapse. Out of the wreckage of Akkad, out of the drought and the famine and the barbarian rule, the people of the south are about to reach down into the ruins and light the whole thing up again, brighter than before. The first death is over. Now watch the first resurrection. Ur 3 matters because it did not merely restore territory. It attempted to solve the political problem revealed by Akkad through standardization. Calendars, measures, labor accounts, tax obligations, livestock records, and official careers were drawn into a denser administrative web. That choice created a distinctive kind of strength. The state could see and mobilize resources with unusual precision. It also created a distinctive kind of vulnerability. When officials defected, harvests failed, or deliveries stopped, the center lost not only revenue, but the information on which the whole system depended. For a while after Akkad fell, the land between the rivers was a quieter, poorer, humbler place. The Akkadian imperial order was gone. The Gutians held loose, clumsy control over parts of the north, collecting tribute and raiding, never really governing. The cities of the south, freed from Akkadian overlords, but stripped of imperial trade and imperial order, turned inward. Life went on, but it was smaller. The territorial order had fractured, and no one immediately restored it on the same scale. And then, in the south, something began to stir. It started, appropriately enough, in one of the oldest cities of all, and with a ruler who did almost nothing that we usually call great. His name was Gudea, and he ruled the city of Lagash, and he did not build an empire. He did not conquer his neighbors. He did not declare himself a god or wash his weapons in distant seas. What he did was rebuild temples, sponsor art, and pray. Dozens of statues of Gudea have survived, and they are unmistakable. They show a calm, round-faced man, seated or standing, his hands clasped quietly in front of him in an attitude of devotion, carved from hard, dark diorite stone, imported at great expense from across the Gulf. There is no violence in them. There is no conquest. There is only a kind of stubborn, patient piety, a man rebuilding what had been broken, one temple at a time. Those quiet statues are the first sign of the resurrection, because they tell you that, even in the broken aftermath of the greatest collapse the world had yet seen, the old skills had not been lost. The artistry was still there. The trade routes could still reach across the Gulf. The wealth could still be gathered. The culture was wounded, but it was not dead. It was waiting. And then a real king appeared to gather it up. Around 2112 BC, a ruler named Ur-Nammu rose in the ancient city of Ur, near the Gulf, drove the Gutians out of the land, and reunited much of the old imperial territory under a single crown. But here is what makes this resurrection so remarkable, and so different from a simple repeat of Akkad. Ur-Nammu did not simply reproduce Akkadian rule. He rebuilt power through law, administration, temple restoration, and the deliberate use of cultural memory. He is remembered, first, as a lawgiver. The law collection associated with his reign is the oldest substantial law code yet known, older than the far more famous laws of Hammurabi by more than 3 centuries. And its spirit is startling. Where later codes would be famous for an eye, physical retribution, Ur-Nammu's laws mostly set fixed payments, monetary compensation, for injuries. More striking still, the code announces its purpose in almost modern-sounding terms. It claims to protect the widow from the powerful, the orphan from the rich, the poor man from the man of wealth. Its provisions reach into the everyday mechanics of urban and agricultural life, including disputes over property, injury, labor, and the use of canals. This is not the boast of a conqueror. This is the voice of an administrator, a builder, a man trying to make a complicated society run fairly and smoothly. And he built. Ur-Nammu raised the monument that, more than any other, has come to symbolize this whole civilization. The great ziggurat of Ur, a massive stepped temple mountain of baked brick, rising in tiers above the flat plain, its best preserved example still standing in the Iraqi desert today, its triple staircase climbing toward a shrine that once crowned the heights. When you picture a ziggurat, you are almost certainly picturing this one. It was a statement, visible for miles, that the old gods were being honored again, that order had returned, that the land had a heart once more. This is the age historians call the Third Dynasty of Ur, or simply Ur-3. And under Ur-Nammu's son Shulgi, it became one of the most intensively documented bureaucratic states of the ancient world. Shulgi ruled for nearly half a century, and he governed through an administrative system of remarkable precision. He standardized the calendar. He reformed weights and measures. He built a network of royal messenger stations with posting houses along the roads, so that communications could race across the realm. He reorganized taxation. He standardized the training of scribes, so that every clerk from one end of the kingdom to the other kept records the same way. The volume of administrative tablets that survives from the Ur-3 period is simply staggering. Many tens of thousands of them, recording the movement of every sheep, every jar of oil, every bushel of grain, every day's labor of every worker in vast state-run workshops where hundreds of women wove textiles for export. It was the resurrection made real. The culture that had died with Akkad was not just back. In many ways it was more organized, more literate, more administratively sophisticated than it had ever been before. This was a golden age, a renaissance, a civilization that had fallen into darkness and clawed its way back into the light, brighter than before. Shulgi, too, eventually declared himself a god, following in Naram-Sin's footsteps, having temples built to his own worship and hymns composed in his honor. Some of them extraordinary poems in which the king is described as the beloved husband of the goddess of love herself, a divine marriage binding the throne to the cosmos. The god-king was back. Royal power and administrative ambition were expanding again. And you already know what that means. The governing problem has now changed form. Ur-3 is more standardized than Akkad, but standardization also increases dependence on accurate records, reliable officials, predictable deliveries, and political compliance across the provinces. The Ur-3 state was more organized than Akkad, yes, but that also meant it was more dependent, more finely balanced, more exposed. And it was about to be brought down not by one enemy, but by a whole cascade of failures at once. And hidden inside that cascade is a killer so quiet, so slow, so invisible, that most tellings of this story skip right over it. It is time to talk about the soil and about salt. This is the part of Mesopotamia's collapse that the popular documentaries almost never handle honestly. And it is one of the most fascinating stories in the whole history of the ancient world, precisely because it is a story about a debate, a genuine scientific argument that is still not fully settled. So let me give it to you the way it actually is, with both sides, because that is worth far more than a comfortable lie. Here is the basic idea, first proposed by scholars studying the ancient tablets and the ancient soil more than half a century ago. Remember how this whole civilization was built on irrigation, on leading river water out onto the fields. Well, river water is not pure. It carries tiny amounts of dissolved salt, not much. In a well-drained landscape, it washes right through and away. But the southern Mesopotamian plain is not well drained. It is dead flat. The water table sits high. When you pour irrigation water onto a field in a blazing hot, dry climate, much of it does not drain away. It sits, and it evaporates under that ferocious sun, and every time it evaporates, it leaves its salt behind. Do that season after season, year after year, century after century, and salt can accumulate in the soil over long periods, especially where drainage is poor, invisible at first, then a faint white crust at the edges of the fields, then a poison that chokes the roots of the crops. And the tablets. Astonishingly, let us watch it happen, because the crops themselves keep a record. Wheat, the more valuable grain, is sensitive to salt. Barley is far more salt-tolerant. And when you read the agricultural records of southern Mesopotamia across the centuries, you can watch the farmers being forced to give up. In the early days, wheat and barley are grown in roughly equal amounts. Then, over the centuries, as the soil slowly poisons itself, the proportion of wheat falls, and falls, and falls. By around 2100 BC, right in this golden age of Ur, wheat has collapsed to a small fraction of the harvest. The farmers have been driven almost entirely onto barley, the only thing that will still grow in the increasingly salty ground. And even barley yields, the records suggest, eventually began to decline. The accounts may preserve evidence of a long adaptation to changing agricultural conditions, although they do not provide a simple, uncontested record of ecological collapse. In the strongest version of this argument, irrigation was gradually damaging parts of the landscape that supported the state. A civilization poisoning itself with its own success, one harvest at a time. It is a haunting story. It is almost too perfect, and that is exactly why you should be careful with it. Because not every scholar agrees. And this is where the honest version parts ways from the pop history version. Some researchers have pushed back hard on the salt story, and their objections matter. They point out that the ancient Mesopotamians were not helpless victims who didn't understand their own land. They knew about salinization, and they had tools to fight it. They could leave fields fallow, unplanted, for a season or more, to let the water table drop and the salt leach down. They could dig drainage channels. They could flush the fields with extra water to wash the salt away. They could manage which fields were used when. These were sophisticated farmers with thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. And the argument goes that a society this smart, this organized, would not simply have stood by and watched its soil turn to poison without fighting back, often successfully. In this view, salinization was a real problem in some places at some times, but it was not the slow, unstoppable, civilization-killing doom that the dramatic version makes it out to be. So who is right? Here is the honest answer, and it is more interesting than either extreme. The evidence for real episodes of serious salinization, especially in the South, in exactly this period, is strong, and many scholars accept that salinization affected parts of southern Mesopotamia. But whether it was the decisive cause of collapse, or just one pressure among many that a well-managed society could partly resist, is genuinely still argued. And that argument itself, that tension between a landscape actively poisoning itself and a clever society fighting to hold it back, is far more true to how collapse actually works than any single clean answer could ever be. And notice what it does to our story. It is the imperial system again. Salinization is not a foreign invader. It is not a drought sent by the gods. It is the direct, built-in consequence of the one activity that made this entire civilization possible. The strength and the fragility are, once again, closely connected processes. You cannot have the irrigated surplus that builds the cities without also, slowly, inviting the salt that can starve them. The same water regime could produce abundance and, if poorly drained or intensively managed, create long-term soil stress. So picture the end of the golden age of Ur. The soil in the heartland is stressed and increasingly salty. The wheat long gone, the barley faltering. Grain prices in the surviving records begin to climb, sometimes dramatically, the unmistakable signature of failing harvests and looming famine. And into that weakened, hungry state, the other failures come pouring in, all at once, just like they did with Akkad. Provincial governors, sensing weakness at the center, stop sending their tax grain and begin acting like independent rulers. Nomadic peoples from the western deserts, the Amorites, push in across the frontier, and the state builds a great wall to keep them out. And the frontier barrier proves unable to stop movement when the state behind it loses resources and cohesion. And then the final blow comes from the east. The kingdom of Elam, in what is now southwestern Iran, an ancient rival and an ancient city builder in its own right, gathers its forces, marches on Ur itself, and around 2004 BC, storms the city, pillages it, desecrates its great ziggurat, and drags the last king of Ur away into captivity, where he presumably died in exile. There survives a lament for the fall of Ur, one of the most moving pieces of writing from the ancient world, and it does not read like a boast or a chronicle. It reads like grief. It speaks of a city defiled, of people wandering like ghosts, of the treasuries emptied, of corpses floating in the Euphrates, the river that had once brought life. The golden age was over. The resurrection had ended in a second death. Read the pattern again, because it is now unmistakable. A collapse, a darkness, a resurrection, brighter than before. And then, hidden inside the very brilliance of that resurrection, the seeds of the next collapse: environmental pressure, fiscal strain, provincial defection, migration, and invasion, interacting within a tightly managed state. Two great civilizations now have risen on this plane and fallen from it. And if this were an ordinary story, that would be the tragedy complete. Rise, fall, rise, fall. A land cursed to repeat its own destruction forever. But something is different this time, because as Ur burned and its last king vanished into exile, the culture did not scatter and die. It flowed sideways, into the hands of new peoples, the very Amorites who had pushed in across the frontier, who now took up the ancient ways, the writing, the gods, the law, the kingship, and made them their own. And in one small, unremarkable town on the Euphrates, a town that had existed for centuries without anyone paying it much attention, one of those Amorite families was about to seize power. The town's name meant Gate of the Gods. Its name was Babylon, and the resurrection it was about to become would give the world one of the most famous kings, one of the most famous law codes, and one of the most famous names in all of human history. The mechanism in this chapter is not the same as the one that weakened Akkad, and it is not the same as the ecological pressure discussed under Ur 3. Hammurabi's problem was political concentration. His kingdom expanded rapidly near the end of a long reign through campaigns, negotiated alliances, broken alliances, and the personal authority of a highly capable king. The question was never whether he could win. The question was whether his successors could inherit the relationships, fear, legitimacy, and strategic timing that had made those victories possible. For about 300 years after the fall of Ur, the land between the rivers went back to what it had been at the very beginning. Not one kingdom, but many. A patchwork of competing city-states, each ruled now by an ambitious dynasty, many of them descended from those Amorite newcomers who had drifted in from the western deserts and taken up the old civilized ways. Cities like Isin and Larsa and Eshnunna and Mari on the middle Euphrates rose and jostled and schemed, each one strong for a while, none of them able to swallow the rest. It was the old rhythm, the old fragmentation, the geography itself pulling the land apart into rivals again, exactly as it had at the dawn of the cities. And in the middle of all this, on the Euphrates in central Mesopotamia, sat a modest town that no one had any particular reason to notice. It had been around for centuries without distinction. Its name meant Gate of the Gods. We know it as Babylon. For its first 100 years under its new Amorite dynasty, Babylon was nothing special, just one middling power among many, its first several kings expanding their little kingdom cautiously, building some walls, digging some canals, restoring some temples, staying alive. If you had drawn a map of the region and asked which city would go on to become the most famous name in the ancient world, a name that would echo through the Bible and Greek history and straight into the modern imagination, almost no one would have pointed to Babylon. Then, around 1792 BC, its sixth king took the throne. His name was Hammurabi. Over the next 43 years, he would turn that unremarkable town into the dominant political center of Mesopotamia. He did not do it quickly, and this is one of the most interesting things about him, because it tells you he understood the political system around him. For the first decades of his reign, Hammurabi mostly waited. He strengthened Babylon from the inside, extending canals, reinforcing walls, building up the economy. He played the diplomatic game, making alliances, breaking them, positioning himself as a mediator in other kingdoms' quarrels, quietly building strength while stronger neighbors exhausted themselves against each other. He was patient in a way that Sargon never was. He was letting the board clear. And then, when his position was secure and his rivals were worn down, he struck and struck and struck. In a lightning series of campaigns in the last third of his reign, Hammurabi swallowed the whole region. He took the southern cities. He crushed the powerful kingdom of Larsa that had dominated the south. He conquered Eshnunna in the east, and Mari on the Euphrates, and finally Ashur in the north, the very city that would one day give rise to the Assyrian Empire. One after another, the great powers fell, and by the end, Hammurabi had done what no one had done since the days of Ur, 3 centuries before. He had united nearly all of Mesopotamia under a single crown. But it is not for his conquests that the world remembers Hammurabi. It is for a stone, around 2¼ meters tall, a pillar of polished black stone, and carved into it, near the top, an image of the king standing before the seated sun god, the god of justice, receiving from him the authority to rule. And below that image, covering the entire rest of the pillar, top to bottom, front and back, in dense columns of cuneiform, are the laws, roughly 280 legal judgments and provisions, depending on how the damaged text is counted, the Code of Hammurabi. It is not, despite the popular belief, the first law code in history. We already met Ur-Nammu's laws, 3 centuries older, but it is the most complete, the most famous, and the most revealing, because it is a window straight into the guts of a living society. These laws are not abstract principles. They are intensely practical. They cover property disputes and inheritance. They cover marriage and divorce and dowries and adultery. They set professional standards with real teeth. A surgeon whose patient died under the knife could lose his hand. A builder whose house collapsed and killed the owner could be put to death. They regulate wages and rents and the interest on loans and the price of hiring a boat or an ox. They are the operating manual of an entire civilization, written in stone. And they reveal, with brutal clarity, exactly what kind of society this was. Because the punishments were not equal, they depended entirely on your rank. This is the code that gives us the famous phrase, an eye for an eye. But read the actual laws, and you find that eye for an eye applied only between social equals. If a nobleman put out the eye of another nobleman, yes, his own eye was forfeit. But if a nobleman put out the eye of a commoner, he simply paid a fine. And if he put out the eye of a slave, he paid the slave's owner a fraction of the slave's value, as if he had damaged someone's property, which, in the eyes of the law, he had. 3 classes, 3 completely different values, placed on the same human eye. This was not a society of equals. It was a rigid hierarchy, and the law existed in large part to keep it rigid. And yet, running right alongside that harshness is something that genuinely reaches across 4,000 years and grabs you. Because Hammurabi announces, in the prologue to his code, that its whole purpose is justice. He says he was called by the gods to make justice appear in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, so that the strong might not oppress the weak. He presents himself not as a conqueror, but as a shepherd, a protector of the orphan and the widow. Whether he believed it, whether it was true, whether it was propaganda, all of that is beside the point. The point is the idea itself, the idea that law should be public, written down as a monumental statement of royal justice, capable of being presented as stable principles rather than a decision invented anew for each dispute. The idea that there should be a standard higher than the whim of whoever happened to be holding the sword. That idea, that justice should be a known and permanent thing rather than an arbitrary one, is one of the most important early landmarks in the history of written law, and here it is, carved into black stone, 38 centuries ago. Under Hammurabi, Babylon blazed. He was not only a conqueror and a lawgiver, but a tireless administrator, and hundreds of his own letters survive, dictated in his own voice, showing a king who personally investigated corruption among his officials, who settled disputes from distant provinces, who managed irrigation projects and religious festivals down to the smallest detail. He elevated Babylon's own city god, Marduk, toward the top of the entire pantheon, mirroring Babylon's new place at the top of the political order. He made the city a center of learning, where scholars gathered and copied and preserved the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 years. This was a golden age. Later Mesopotamians would look back on the reign of Hammurabi the way we look back on a lost paradise, a time when the land was united, justice prevailed, and the great city stood at the center of everything. Royal ideology presented the achievement as permanent. It lasted about as long as Hammurabi did, but Hammurabi's victories created a succession problem that his own skill could only postpone. Hammurabi died around 1750 BC and left his throne to his son, and the son inherited what looked like a stable, unified, golden kingdom. It was an illusion. Within a few years, the southern cities, with their ancient traditions and their long memories of independence, rose in revolt. They were put down and rose again, and were put down and rose again, each rebellion peeling a little more territory away from Babylon's control. A new power emerged from the marshes of the Deep South and seized the coastal regions. Mountain peoples pressed in from the east. Year by year, decade by decade, the great empire of Hammurabi shrank back toward the single city where it had begun. Within 50 years of his death, most of the south was simply gone. Once again, the same pattern. The empire had been welded together by the genius and the will of a single extraordinary man, and it had no mechanism to hold itself together once that man was gone. Territories held together by diplomacy, campaigning, and personal authority proved difficult for his successors to retain. But the golden age of Babylon did not end with the usual slow bleed of rebellion and shrinkage. It ended with one of the strangest, most shocking blows in the whole story. A blow that came, quite literally, out of nowhere. Around 1595 BC, roughly a century and a half after Hammurabi's death, a distant Anatolian power reached Babylon in a raid whose precise route and strategic context remain debated. From the highlands of central Anatolia, modern Turkey, hundreds of miles to the northwest, an Indo-European people called the Hittites had been quietly building a kingdom of their own, entirely off the Babylonian radar, and their king led an army on a raid of almost unbelievable range, marching over 500 miles from his homeland, deep into the heart of Mesopotamia, all the way to Babylon itself. Babylon was unable to stop the attack. They were braced, as always, against the familiar threats from the east and the south. They were not looking north. The Hittites smashed through the city's defenses, plundered its treasures, and toppled the dynasty of Hammurabi that had ruled for 3 centuries. And then, having no interest in actually holding a city so impossibly far from home, they simply took their loot and left, marching back to Anatolia and vanishing from the story as suddenly as they had appeared. It was a raid, not a conquest, but it was enough. The old dynasty was shattered, the golden age was over, and Babylon lay stunned and leaderless in the vacuum. Into that vacuum stepped yet another people, the Kassites, mountain folk from the east who had been drifting into Babylonian territory for generations as workers and mercenaries. They seized the throne and founded a dynasty that would, incredibly, rule Babylon for something like 400 years, longer than any dynasty in the city's history. And here is the twist that keeps this from being just another tragedy. The Kassites were foreign conquerors, and they changed almost nothing. They adopted the Babylonian gods, the Babylonian language, the Babylonian law, the Babylonian way of life. They tended Marduk's temple. They preserved the literature. They kept the administration running. The dynasty that had built the Golden Age was gone, smashed by raiders from the north and replaced by conquerors from the east. And yet the civilization itself, the deep structure of it, simply flowed on, wearing new rulers like a change of clothes. That is the resurrection hiding inside this collapse. The political leadership changed violently, first by the Hittites and then by the Kassites. But the civilization did not die. It absorbed its conquerors. It made them Babylonian. It survived not by resisting change, but by swallowing it. And it went on for 4 more centuries under kings whose ancestors had come as outsiders. The land had died and risen twice as an empire, with Akkad and with Ur. Now it had learned a new trick. It could lose its rulers entirely and keep its soul, converting every conqueror into a caretaker of its own ancient ways. It was a remarkable kind of immortality, and it was about to be tested as it had never been tested before. Because a darkness was coming, not a local darkness, not the fall of one city or one dynasty, a darkness that would fall across the wider ancient world at once, from Greece to Egypt to Anatolia to Mesopotamia, a catastrophe so vast and so total that historians would give it a name that sounds like the end of the world itself, what historians call the End Bronze Age collapse, or more cautiously, the End Bronze Age crisis. The mechanism in this chapter is not the same as the one that weakened Akkad, and it is not the same as the ecological pressure discussed under Ur 3. Hammurabi's problem was political concentration. His kingdom expanded rapidly near the end of a long reign through campaigns, negotiated alliances, broken alliances, and the personal authority of a highly capable king. The question was never whether he could win. The question was whether his successors could inherit the relationships, fear, legitimacy, and strategic timing that had made those victories possible. For about 300 years after the fall of Ur, the land between the rivers went back to what it had been at the very beginning. Not one kingdom, but many. A patchwork of competing city-states, each ruled now by an ambitious dynasty, many of them descended from those Amorite newcomers who had drifted in from the western deserts and taken up the old civilized ways. Cities like Isin and Lhasa and Eshnunna and Mari on the middle Euphrates rose and jostled and schemed, each one strong for a while, none of them able to swallow the rest. It was the old rhythm, the old fragmentation, the geography itself pulling the land apart into rivals again, exactly as it had at the dawn of the cities. And in the middle of all this, on the Euphrates in central Mesopotamia, sat a modest town that no one had any particular reason to notice. It had been around for centuries without distinction. Its name meant Gate of the Gods. We know it as Babylon. For its first 100 years, under its new Amorite dynasty, Babylon was nothing special, just one middling power among many. Its first several kings, expanding their little kingdom cautiously, building some walls, digging some canals, restoring some temples, staying alive. If you had drawn a map of the region and asked which city would go on to become the most famous name in the ancient world, a name that would echo through the Bible and Greek history and straight into the modern imagination, almost no one would have pointed to Babylon. Then, around 1792 BC, its 6th king took the throne. His name was Hammurabi. Over the next 43 years, he would turn that unremarkable town into the dominant political center of Mesopotamia. He did not do it quickly, and this is one of the most interesting things about him, because it tells you he understood the political system around him. For the first decades of his reign, Hammurabi mostly waited. He strengthened Babylon from the inside, extending canals, reinforcing walls, building up the economy. He played the diplomatic game, making alliances, breaking them, positioning himself as a mediator in other kingdoms' quarrels, quietly building strength while stronger neighbors exhausted themselves against each other. He was patient in a way that Sargon never was. He was letting the board clear. And then, When his position was secure and his rivals were worn down, he struck and struck and struck. In a lightning series of campaigns in the last third of his reign, Hammurabi swallowed the whole region. He took the southern cities. He crushed the powerful kingdom of Lhasa that had dominated the south. He conquered Eshnunna in the east, and Mari on the Euphrates, and finally Ashur in the north, the very city that would one day give rise to the Assyrian Empire. One after another, the great powers fell, and by the end Hammurabi had done what no one had done since the days of Ur 3 centuries before. He had united nearly all of Mesopotamia under a single crown. But it is not for his conquests that the world remembers Hammurabi. It is for a stone, around 2¼ meters tall, a pillar of polished black stone, and carved into it, near the top, an image of the king standing before the seated sun god, the god of justice, receiving from him the authority to rule. And below that image, covering the entire rest of the pillar, top to bottom, front and back, in dense columns of cuneiform, are the laws. Roughly 280 legal judgments and provisions, depending on how the damaged text is counted. The Code of Hammurabi. It is not, despite the popular belief, the first law code in history. We already met Ur-Nammu's laws, 3 centuries older. But it is the most complete, the most famous, and the most revealing, because it is a window straight into the guts of a living society. These laws are not abstract principles. They are intensely practical. They cover property disputes and inheritance. They cover marriage and divorce and dowries and adultery. They set professional standards with real teeth. A surgeon whose patient died under the knife could lose his hand. A builder whose house collapsed and killed the owner could be put to death. They regulate wages and rents and the interest on loans and the price of hiring a boat or an ox. They are the operating manual of an entire civilization, written in stone. And they reveal, with brutal clarity, exactly what kind of society this was. Because the punishments were not equal, they depended entirely on your rank. This is the code that gives us the famous phrase, an eye for an eye. But read the actual laws, and you find that eye for an eye applied only between social equals. If a nobleman put out the eye of another nobleman, yes, his own eye was forfeit. But if a nobleman put out the eye of a commoner, he simply paid a fine. And if he put out the eye of a slave, he paid the slave's owner a fraction of the slave's value, as if he had damaged someone's property, which, in the eyes of the law, he had. 3 classes, 3 completely different values, placed on the same human eye. This was not a society of equals. It was a rigid hierarchy, and the law existed in large part to keep it rigid. And yet, running right alongside that harshness is something that genuinely reaches across 4,000 years and grabs you, because Hammurabi announces, in the prologue to his code, that its whole purpose is justice. He says he was called by the gods to make justice appear in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, so that the strong might not oppress the weak. He presents himself not as a conqueror but as a shepherd, a protector of the orphan and the widow. Whether he believed it, whether it was true, whether it was propaganda, all of that is beside the point. The point is the idea itself. The idea that law should be public, written down as a monumental statement of royal justice, capable of being presented as stable principles rather than a decision invented anew for each dispute. The idea that there should be a standard higher than the whim of whoever happened to be holding the sword. That idea that justice should be a known and permanent thing rather than an arbitrary one is one of the most important early landmarks in the history of written law, and here it is, carved into black stone, 38 centuries ago. Under Hammurabi, Babylon blazed. He was not only a conqueror and a lawgiver, but a tireless administrator, and hundreds of his own letters survive, dictated in his own voice, showing a king who personally investigated corruption among his officials, who settled disputes from distant provinces, who managed irrigation projects and religious festivals down to the smallest detail. He elevated Babylon's own city god, Marduk, toward the top of the entire pantheon, mirroring Babylon's new place at the top of the political order. He made the city a center of learning, where scholars gathered and copied and preserved the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 years. This was a golden age. Later Mesopotamians would look back on the reign of Hammurabi the way we look back on a lost paradise, a time when the land was united, justice prevailed, and the great city stood at the center of everything. Royal ideology presented the achievement as permanent. It lasted about as long as Hammurabi did, but Hammurabi's victories created a succession problem that his own skill could only postpone. Hammurabi died around 1750 BC and left his throne to his son, and the son inherited what looked like a stable, unified golden kingdom. It was an illusion. Within a few years, the southern cities, with their ancient traditions and their long memories of independence, rose in revolt. They were put down and rose again, and were put down and rose again, each rebellion peeling a little more territory away from Babylon's control. A new power emerged from the marshes of the Deep South and seized the coastal regions. Mountain peoples pressed in from the east. Year by year, decade by decade, the great empire of Hammurabi shrank back toward the single city where it had begun. Within 50 years of his death, most of the south was simply gone. Once again, the same pattern. The empire had been welded together by the genius and the will of a single extraordinary man, and it had no mechanism to hold itself together once that man was gone. Territories held together by diplomacy, campaigning, and personal authority proved difficult for his successors to retain. But the golden age of Babylon did not end with the usual slow bleed of rebellion and shrinkage. It ended with one of the strangest, most shocking blows in the whole story. A blow that came, quite literally, out of nowhere. Around 1595 BC, roughly a century and a half after Hammurabi's death, a distant Anatolian power reached Babylon in a raid whose precise route and strategic context remain debated. From the highlands of central Anatolia, modern Turkey, hundreds of miles to the northwest, an Indo-European people, called the Hittites, had been quietly building a kingdom of their own, entirely off the Babylonian radar, and their king led an army on a raid of almost unbelievable range, marching over 500 miles from his homeland, deep into the heart of Mesopotamia, all the way to Babylon itself. Babylon was unable to stop the attack. They were braced, as always, against the familiar threats from the east and the south. They were not looking north. The Hittites smashed through the city's defenses, plundered its treasures, and toppled the dynasty of Hammurabi that had ruled for 3 centuries. And then, having no interest in actually holding a city so impossibly far from home, they simply took their loot and left, marching back to Anatolia and vanishing from the story as suddenly as they had appeared. It was a raid, not a conquest. But it was enough. The old dynasty was shattered. The golden age was over, and Babylon lay stunned and leaderless in the vacuum. Into that vacuum stepped yet another people, the Kassites, mountain folk from the east who had been drifting into Babylonian territory for generations as workers and mercenaries. They seized the throne and founded a dynasty that would, incredibly, rule Babylon for something like 400 years, longer than any dynasty in the city's history. And here is the twist that keeps this from being just another tragedy. The Kassites were foreign conquerors, and they changed almost nothing. They adopted the Babylonian gods, the Babylonian language, the Babylonian law, the Babylonian way of life. They tended Marduk's temple. They preserved the literature. They kept the administration running. The dynasty that had built the Golden Age was gone, smashed by raiders from the north and replaced by conquerors from the east. And yet the civilization itself, the deep structure of it, simply flowed on, wearing new rulers like a change of clothes. That is the resurrection hiding inside this collapse. The political leadership changed violently, first by the Hittites and then by the Kassites. But the civilization did not die. It absorbed its conquerors. It made them Babylonian. It survived not by resisting change but by swallowing it, and it went on for 4 more centuries under kings whose ancestors had come as outsiders. The land had died and risen twice as an empire, with Akkad and with Now it had learned a new trick. It could lose its rulers entirely and keep its soul, converting every conqueror into a caretaker of its own ancient ways. It was a remarkable kind of immortality, and it was about to be tested as it had never been tested before, because a darkness was coming, not a local darkness, not the fall of one city or one dynasty, a darkness that would fall across the wider ancient world at once, from Greece to Egypt to Anatolia to Mesopotamia, a catastrophe so vast and so total that historians would give it a name that sounds like the end of the world itself, what historians call the End Bronze Age collapse, or more cautiously, the End Bronze Age crisis. Assyria's distinctive achievement was not cruelty alone, and reducing the empire to cruelty makes its later collapse harder to understand. Its real power came from combining coercion with information. Officials counted, reported, mapped, inspected, relayed orders, recorded tribute, supervised roads, and moved populations. Armies could act quickly because administrators made distance legible to the court. Terror discouraged rebellion, but intelligence told the king where rebellion was forming, logistics carried troops toward it, and provincial government attempted to make conquest permanent. Every civilization is shaped by the land that made it, and Assyria was shaped by fear. The Assyrian heartland lay in the north, in the hills along the upper Tigris, a very different country from the flat, irrigated south. Here there was enough rain to farm without canals, but there was also something the south, tucked away near the Gulf, never had to face constantly. Assyria had no natural borders. It sat exposed, on open ground, surrounded on nearly every side by rivals and raiders, by mountain peoples and rival kingdoms, and hungry nomads. From its earliest days, Assyria lived with the knowledge that danger could come from any direction at any time, and that the only thing standing between survival and annihilation was its own strength. Out of that permanent insecurity, over many centuries, Assyria forged an identity unlike anything else in the ancient world. It became a society organized, from top to bottom, around military power, where the cities of the south worshipped gods of water and wisdom and love. Assyria worshipped, above all, its own national god, Ashur. And Ashur was not merely one god among many equals. Ashur was the state itself, made divine. To expand Assyria was to expand the domain of Ashur. To conquer was to do the god's will. War was not politics. War was worship. And so Assyrian kings did not present their endless campaigns as ambition or greed. They presented them as sacred duty, holy wars fought for the honor of their god. And a king who failed to go to war each year was failing not just his people, but heaven itself. For a long time, Assyria was just a trading city-state, a community of merchants who ran caravan networks, stretching up into Anatolia. It survived the Bronze Age collapse better than most, contracting but never breaking. And then, slowly, over the centuries of the early Iron Age, it began to turn outward, and the trading city became an increasingly militarized kingdom, and that kingdom became an empire of unprecedented scale in Mesopotamian history. At its height in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the Neo-Assyrian Empire is often described as the first great imperial superpower of the ancient Near East. Not a collection of tributary cities like Sargon's Akkad, not a single unified land like Hammurabi's Babylon, but a vast, multi-continental empire that stretched, at its greatest extent, from the mountains of western Iran across all of Mesopotamia, through Syria and the Levant, and into Egypt, from the Persian Gulf to central Anatolia. It ruled a vast and diverse population speaking many languages, although exact population totals cannot be recovered with confidence. It brought a larger share of the Near East under direct and indirect rule than any earlier Mesopotamian state, and it was held together by a combination of provincial administration, military logistics, negotiated loyalty, deportation, tribute, and exemplary terror. The Assyrian military system helps explain how the empire expanded so far and intervened so quickly across the region. Where earlier armies had relied heavily on part-time levies, farmers called up for a season and sent home for the harvest, Assyria built a substantial standing royal army supported by provincial levies and specialized troops. Soldiers maintained year-round, trained, disciplined, and ready. Iron weapons were only one part of the picture, and Assyria did not possess them alone. Its greater advantage lay in organization, year-round forces, specialized units, siege engineering, intelligence, logistics, and the ability to replace losses across a large imperial base. They fielded coordinated combined forces, chariots and cavalry and archers, and, most terrifyingly, specialized siege engineers, because the Assyrians solved a problem that had stopped conquerors for millennia, the problem of the walled city. Earlier armies could beat you in the field, but a strong city behind strong walls could delay or defeat a campaign. The Assyrians brought the walls down. They built battering rams, mobile siege towers, and teams of sappers who tunneled beneath the foundations. They systematized siege warfare, and it meant that few fortified centers could assume they were beyond Assyria's reach. And behind the army came the administration, because this is the second thing, the part that gets forgotten in the stories of Assyrian cruelty. Assyria did not just conquer, it governed. It organized its vast conquests into provinces, each run by a governor appointed directly by the king and answerable directly to the king. It built networks of roads and relay stations and messenger systems so that orders from the capital could reach the far frontiers in days rather than weeks. A communications network of exceptional speed and reach for its time. It took the sons of conquered local nobles and brought them back to the Assyrian court, educating them, absorbing them into the imperial system, and, not incidentally, holding them as hostages to guarantee their father's loyalty. It was, in its administrative genius, a preview of every great empire that would follow. Persia, Rome, all of them. The Assyrians did not rely on terror alone. They refined administrative practices that later empires would adapt on an even larger scale. But it is the terror that everyone remembers, and it was not an accident, and it was not mere cruelty for its own sake. It functioned as policy, deliberate, calculated, and strategic, even though royal propaganda may exaggerate both scale and uniformity. Assyrian rulers acted on a cold calculation about ruling millions of resentful, conquered people with the limited armies of the ancient world. You cannot garrison everywhere. You cannot be strong everywhere at once. So you rule instead by fear. You make the price of rebellion so horrifying, so unthinkable, that no one dares to pay it. Assyrian armies committed atrocities, and royal inscriptions and palace reliefs deliberately advertised exemplary punishment. Their royal inscriptions boast, in explicit and stomach-turning detail, of the punishments inflicted on those who resisted. Rebels flayed alive, their skins nailed to the city walls, captives impaled on stakes outside the gates, whole populations put to the sword, and they carved these scenes into the stone walls of their palaces, immense, detailed reliefs of siege and slaughter, and captives led away in chains, displayed not in hidden vaults, but in the public halls where every visitor, every foreign envoy, every subject prince would see them and understand, in their bones, exactly what defiance of Assyria would cost. The art was the message. The message was, do not resist. It is not worth what will happen to you. And there was one more tool, quieter than the flaying knives, but in its way even more devastating, and it reveals the full scope of Assyrian ambition: mass deportation. When a region rebelled, the Assyrians did not just punish the ringleaders. They uprooted entire populations, tens of thousands of people at a time, and marched them across the empire to be resettled somewhere else entirely, often replacing them with deportees from some other conquered land. It was a strategy of breathtaking scale and coldness. It could fracture local political networks and weaken established centers of resistance. It broke the bonds of place and community and shared history that make rebellion possible. Dispersed communities could still preserve identity and sometimes resist, but deportation made coordinated rebellion more difficult, while moving labor and expertise to locations chosen by the state. And at the same time, it moved skilled workers and needed labor wherever the empire wanted them. It was social engineering as an instrument of empire, and it churned the human map of the entire Near East. One of the most famous of these deportations would echo down through history in a way the Assyrians could never have imagined, but we will come to that. This was Assyria at its height, militarily dominant, administratively sophisticated, territorially vast, and feared across the Near East. It conquered from Egypt to Iran. It ruled through a genius of administration and a genius of terror. Its kings called themselves King of the Universe, King of the four quarters of the world, and for a while, it did not even sound like a boast. And I want you to sit for a moment with the strangest thing about Assyria, because it is going to matter enormously in the arcs to come. This state, remembered above all for cruelty, this empire that flayed its enemies and carved their agony into its walls, was also, at its very peak, one of a major patron of knowledge and preservation in the ancient world. Its last great king boasted not only of his conquests, but of his literacy, an unusual thing for a warrior king to brag about. He claimed he could read the ancient languages himself, without a scribe to help him, and under his patronage, in the capital at Nineveh, scholars assembled a library, not a small collection, a systematic, deliberate, comprehensive effort to gather the written knowledge of all of Mesopotamia. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, copied from temples and archives across the whole civilization. Myths and hymns, medical texts and astronomical observations, histories and dictionaries, and the great epics. The accumulated intellectual inheritance of nearly 3,000 years, gathered under one roof, in the palace of one of the most feared kings of his age. Hold that image, because it is one of the great ironies of human history, and we will return to it. The empire of terror was also the empire of the library. The same power that impaled its enemies also, almost single-handedly, preserved the literature of the ancient world for the future. Strength and knowledge, cruelty and preservation, all bound together in the same impossible state. No previous Mesopotamian empire had coordinated armies, tribute, information, roads, and provincial rule across such a wide territory. At its height, Assyria joined immense coercive power to an equally ambitious effort to collect and organize knowledge. But scale alone does not explain what happened next. To understand Assyria's fall, we have to examine the particular stresses hidden inside this particular empire. That combination makes the speed of its later collapse more difficult and, more importantly, more necessary to explain. The reversal will come within a single human lifetime. A state that had dominated much of the Near East will lose its royal centers, its dynasty, and its ability to reproduce imperial rule. The capitals will be devastated so thoroughly that later political memory will belong mainly to Assyria's enemies and successors. even though people continue living in the wider region. How does an empire with this much military experience, administrative reach, and accumulated wealth lose its core so quickly? That is the central problem of the next arc. The title needs precision. Assyria did not vanish from history in exactly 3 years. Its heartland suffered a sequence of catastrophic defeats. Ashur fell in 614 BC, Nineveh in 612 BC, and organized resistance continued from western strongholds until 609 BC. The astonishing fact is not that every Assyrian institution disappeared overnight. It is that the imperial core of a state that had dominated the region for generations was destroyed within a remarkably short sequence of military defeats, leaving no successful Assyrian successor kingdom to reclaim the center. Here is a fact that has haunted historians for more than 100 years. In the early 630s BC, Assyria still appeared to be the dominant power of the Near East. Its armies had campaigned from Egypt to the Iranian frontier. Its provincial system drew resources toward the royal court, and Nineveh displayed the confidence of a capital whose rulers called it a city without rival. Exact population and revenue figures cannot be recovered, but the scale of the state is beyond dispute. By 609 BC, organized Assyrian resistance had ended. The people of the region did not disappear, nor did every Assyrian cultural practice vanish, but the imperial dynasty, the royal capitals, and the state that had governed the Near East were gone. For later audiences, Assyria survived most vividly in hostile literary memory until 19th-century excavations revealed the scale of its palaces, archives, and art. The destruction of the core happened faster still. Ashur fell in 614 BC, and Nineveh in 612 BC. Those 2 years did not contain the whole collapse, but they did contain the loss of the empire's sacred and royal centers. Assyrian forces continued in the west until 609 BC, yet no recovery of the heartland followed. How did a Babylonian-led coalition and the Medes break into a heartland that Assyrian kings had defended for centuries? Why did the empire fail to regenerate after losing its capitals, when other Mesopotamian states had recovered from grave defeats? This is the most abrupt imperial breakdown in our story, and it brings several earlier themes together without reducing Assyria to a copy of Akkad or overextension, succession conflict, accumulated enemies, the dependence of armies on provincial resources, and a possible environmental stress in the agricultural core. Let's start with the easy answer, the one you will hear most often, because it is not wrong. It is just radically incomplete. The easy answer is civil war and overextension, and both of those are absolutely real. Start with the cost of scale. Every province had to be supervised, taxed, defended, and connected to the court. New conquests produced tribute and labor, but they also produced longer frontiers, more garrisons, and more opportunities for revolt. Assyria did not literally need to conquer every year in order to survive, yet campaigning had become deeply embedded in royal legitimacy and imperial finance. Coercion bought obedience, but exemplary violence and repeated deportation also gave many subject communities strong reasons to support any coalition capable of breaking Assyrian control. Fear could suppress resistance while the center looked invincible. It could not guarantee loyalty once the center appeared divided. Now add succession conflict. The exact year of Ashurbanipal's death remains uncertain, but rival claimants and factions soon weakened coordination at the center. Armies and officials that should have defended the imperial system were drawn into struggles over who had the right to command it. Provinces did not all rebel at once, but the spectacle of division changed their calculations. A state that had ruled partly by the expectation of rapid punishment could no longer make that punishment appear certain everywhere. That was the opening, In Babylon, a Chaldean leader named Nabopolassar declared independence, and, unlike the countless Babylonian rebels the Assyrians had crushed before, he proved impossible to put down, and then he did the thing that sealed Assyria's fate. He allied with the Medes, a rising power from the Iranian highlands, a people with their own grudges against Assyria. Together, this coalition marched on the Assyrian heartland itself, on the great cities that had ruled the world. The religious center of Ashur fell in 614 BC, and then, in 612 BC, they came to Nineveh. And that brings us back to where this film began. After a siege described in later sources, Nineveh fell in 612 BC. The walls were breached, palaces burned, and the king Sin-shar-ishkun disappeared from the record. He may have died in the destruction, but the evidence does not allow certainty. The city never recovered its role as an imperial capital. Assyrian leaders continued resistance from Haran and then farther west, but after their defeat in 609 BC, the empire no longer existed as an organized state. Scale, hostile subject populations, succession conflict, and a strong enemy coalition take us far, but they still leave a question. Many empires survive civil wars or lose provinces without losing their core. Why did Assyria's crisis become irreversible so quickly? One proposed part of the answer lies beneath the politics, in the rain-fed agricultural zone that supported the heartland. And here is where modern research has added something that transforms the whole picture, and it is the same ghost that has haunted this entire story from the beginning. Climate. Recent paleoclimate research has reconstructed changing rainfall in northern Mesopotamia, but the evidence must be used carefully. Climate cannot explain Assyria's rise or fall by itself, and regional reconstructions do not translate directly into annual harvest totals. They can, however, show whether political crisis unfolded during conditions that made food production and taxation more difficult. Some reconstructions suggest that parts of Assyria's expansion coincided with relatively favorable moisture conditions. Better rainfall would have supported rain-fed agriculture, population, taxation, and the provisioning of armies. That does not mean climate created the empire. Conquest, administration, technology, and political choices did that. Favorable conditions may simply have enlarged the resources available to those institutions. Other reconstructions point to severe drought episodes in the 7th century BC, near the period of Assyria's political crisis. Estimates of timing, duration, and local severity vary, so it would be reckless to convert a proxy record into one precise, empire-wide percentage. The important possibility is narrower. Reduced rainfall may have lowered agricultural and fiscal flexibility in the heartland, at the same time that civil conflict and invasion demanded extraordinary resources. Put the pressures together, but keep their different evidentiary weight in view. The empire carried the costs of a wide territorial system. The succession divided leadership. Babylonian rebels established an independent base. The Medes added military power from the east. Subject populations had little reason to rescue Assyria. Drought may have reduced the reserves available to the heartland. None of these conditions guarantees collapse. Together, they narrowed the state's room to recover after each defeat. That convergence helps explain why a process of weakening accelerated into catastrophe. The central cities fell between 614 and 612 BC, and organized resistance ended by 609 BC. The chronology is dramatic enough without compressing the entire history into a 3-year slogan. Assyria did not fall because one support was removed. It failed to reconstruct authority after several supports were damaged at once. The best scholarship, therefore, returns to caution. Each proposed cause may have contributed, but none is sufficient by itself. That is the limit of the single cause story. Akkad, Ur, and Assyria did not share one identical mechanism, yet all show how political conflict, environmental pressure, and institutional dependence can reinforce one another. In retrospect, the convergence appears visible. To people living inside it, each setback may still have looked temporary until recovery was no longer possible. Now, remember the great irony we planted in the last arc. The Empire of Terror was also the Empire of the Library. And here is where that irony completes itself, in the most extraordinary way. When Nineveh burned, when the palaces collapsed, and the fires roared through the halls, the great library of clay tablets, many tens of thousands of them, the gathered knowledge of 3,000 years, was buried in the burning rubble. Clay responds to destruction unevenly. Some tablets were already fired, others were only dried, and intense heat hardened part of the collection while damaging other pieces. The collapse of the palace then buried thousands of tablets and fragments beneath debris. That combination helped preserve versions of myths, medical texts, lexical lists, omens, astronomy, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. The fire was not a perfect archivist, and the library was never the whole literature of Mesopotamia. Yet the catastrophe that ended the palace helped protect part of what its scholars had gathered. Sit with the irony, but do not simplify it. Assyrian collection created the archive. Generations of scribes created the texts. Clay gave some of them durability. Destruction buried them. Archaeology recovered them. The fall became one link in a much longer chain of preservation. The Assyrian imperial state was gone, its capitals devastated, and its dynasty extinguished. To anyone who equated civilization with the ruling empire, the land between the rivers might have appeared finished. Yet the people, cities, temples, archives, and ambitions beyond the Assyrian court had not vanished with it. And yet, even as Nineveh burned 300 miles to the south, that Babylonian leader who had lit the fire was already sharpening a new ambition. The old city on the Euphrates, the gate of the gods, the city of Hammurabi, the city that had spent centuries under the boot of one foreign master after another, was stirring, and it was about to rise into a final major imperial age, becoming one of the most celebrated cities in ancient memory. The last great resurrection in this film was about to begin, driven not only by victory, but by the politics of restoration and display. Babylon's revival also followed a different logic. Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar did not simply copy Assyria with a new capital. They converted victory into legitimacy by restoring temples, rebuilding walls, reviving royal ritual, and presenting Babylon as the rightful center of an ancient sacred order. Monumental construction was not decoration added after power had been won. It was one of the ways power explained itself, turning forced labor, tribute, imported materials, and military success into a city that appeared protected by the gods and anchored in the deepest past. When the fires of Nineveh finally died down and the smoke cleared over the ruins of Assyria, the land between the rivers faced a question it had faced many times before. Who now? Who would rise from the ashes this time? The answer was a city that had been waiting, patiently, in the shadow of empires, for more than 1,000 years. Babylon, the gate of the gods, the city of Hammurabi, whose golden age had ended 12 centuries earlier, the city that had been raided by the Hittites, ruled by the Kassites, dominated and rebelled and dominated again by the Assyrians. Its great temple of Marduk, renovated and looted and renovated again by a parade of masters. Through all of it, across more than a millennium of foreign rule, Babylon had never been erased. Its ziggurat still rose above the plain. Its priests still tended Marduk's shrine. Its name still carried an ancient weight, a prestige that no conqueror had ever quite been able to take away. It was, by now, one of the oldest, continuously important cities on Earth, and it had spent 1,000 years being ruled by others. Now, With Assyria destroyed by the coalition that exploited its internal weakness, its moment had come at last. The Babylonian leader, Nabopolassar, the man who had allied with the Medes and burned Nineveh, claimed the lion's share of the shattered Assyrian world and founded a new dynasty. Historians call it the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and it was, from the start, something more than a mere grab for territory. It was a conscious, deliberate act of resurrection, a reclaiming of Babylon's ancient birthright as the sacred and political heart of an ancient tradition, a declaration that the city of Hammurabi was rising again to take a central place in the Near Eastern political world. And then Nabopolassar's son took the throne and gave the world a name it has never forgotten: Nebuchadnezzar II. He reigned for more than 40 years, from 605 to 562 BC, and his memory divided sharply according to who was remembering. Babylonian royal inscriptions present a restorer of temples, walls, and sacred order. Biblical tradition remembers the conqueror who destroyed Jerusalem and carried part of Judah's population into exile. Both memories belong to the same reign, but neither alone contains the whole man or the whole empire. Let's take the conquest first, because it is the thread that ties this arc, improbably, to a story half the world still tells. Nebuchadnezzar inherited his father's wars and pushed Babylonian power across the Near East, into Syria and the Levant, the old western territories of the fallen Assyrian Empire. And there, in the small kingdom of Judah, he met resistance. He besieged its capital, Jerusalem, first in 597 BC, carrying off its king and thousands of its leading citizens to Babylon. And then, when Judah rebelled again, he came back, and in 587 BC he was merciless. Jerusalem's walls were torn down. Its great temple, the Temple of Solomon, was burned to the ground, and its people, its priests and nobles and skilled workers, were marched hundreds of miles into captivity in Babylon, in the event the Bible calls the Babylonian exile. Remember the Assyrian use of mass deportation on an imperial scale, the uprooting of whole peoples to break their identity. Here it is again, wielded by Babylon now, and here is the extraordinary thing about this particular deportation. It did not erase the identity of the deported Judean community. Over time, exile became one setting in which that identity was reworked and preserved. The exiled community of Judah, sitting by the rivers of Babylon, weeping when they remembered their lost city, did not dissolve into their conquerors as so many deported peoples had. Separated from Jerusalem and its temple, Judean communities placed new weight on texts, law, memory, communal practice, and the hope of restoration, although temple-centered religion did not simply disappear. The exile became one important setting in the long composition, editing, and preservation of traditions that would form the Hebrew Bible, although those texts emerged across different places and periods, rather than in one single act of writing. The religious reflection intensified by exile would become deeply important to later Judaism and, through more complex lines of inheritance, to Christianity and Islam. Nebuchadnezzar meant to end rebellion and secure Babylonian control of Judah. Instead, by dragging its people to Babylon, the exile became part of the historical setting in which a remarkably durable religious tradition developed. The deportation that was meant to be an ending became, for its victims, a strange and terrible beginning. Collapse and resurrection, working their pattern now on a conquered people, right in the heart of the empire. But it is not for the exile that Nebuchadnezzar built his own legend. It is for the city he raised. Because with the wealth of his conquests pouring in, Nebuchadnezzar turned Babylon into a wonder, a city whose monuments and later legends would grip the imagination of many societies that came after. He rebuilt it on a monumental scale rarely matched in the ancient Near East. The city grew to cover a vast expanse, its population swelling to perhaps 80,000 people or more. making it very likely one of the largest cities of its age. He raised massive double walls around it, walls so broad, the later Greeks would marvel, that a 4-horse chariot could turn around on top of them. He cut canals and quays to manage the Euphrates, which ran right through the heart of the city. And he built, at the ceremonial entrance to the city, a gate that has become one of the most recognizable surviving monuments of ancient Mesopotamia. The Ishtar Gate, faced entirely in glazed brick of a deep, luminous blue, and across that field of blue, in rows, the raised figures of lions and bulls and dragons, striding in gold and white. To walk through the Ishtar Gate, along the great processional way lined with those same glazed beasts, must have been an overwhelming display of royal and sacred power for visitors of that age. It was a statement, in color and light, that you were entering a city designed to present itself as the sacred center of the world. At the heart of the city rose the great ziggurat, dedicated to Marduk, climbing in stepped tiers toward the heavens, whose memory became entangled, in later interpretation, with the biblical Tower of Babel, the state by which humanity, in the biblical story, tried to reach the sky. Beside it stood Marduk's main temple, housing the god's golden statue and the treasures of a conquered world. And somewhere in the palace complex, according to a Greek tradition we can no longer verify, Nebuchadnezzar built the hanging gardens, terraces of exotic trees and flowers, rising in green tiers above the dusty plain, watered by some ingenious hidden mechanism, built, the story says, to comfort his wife, who came from the green mountains of the east and pined for them amid the flat brown fields of Babylon. Whether the hanging gardens truly existed, or whether they were a later legend, archaeologists still debate. But here is what matters. They became listed by later Greek and Roman writers among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The uncertainty matters. The gardens may reflect a real Babylonian project, a confused memory of Assyrian royal gardens, or a literary image amplified by later writers. In every case, the tradition reveals the extraordinary imaginative power that the name Babylon acquired in the ancient Mediterranean world. And it was not only stone and glaze. Under the Neo-Babylonians, this last resurrection reached extraordinary intellectual heights. Babylonian astronomers, tracking the movements of the planets across the sky for religious and divinatory purposes, night after night, year after year, accumulated observations so precise and so systematic that they began to do something genuinely new in human history. They began to predict. They developed mathematical models that could forecast the positions of the moon and the planets, the timing of eclipses, the cycles of the heavens. These methods became a major foundation of mathematical astronomy and influenced later Greek scholarship through channels that were neither simple nor one-directional. The empire that rose from the ashes of Assyria was not just beautiful. Its scholarly communities made some of the ancient world's most important contributions to mathematical astronomy. This was the resurrection at its most glorious. Not a grim rebuilding after catastrophe, but a genuine golden age, one of antiquity's most legendary cities, blazing with blue and gold, humming with astronomers charting the heavens, the ancient culture of the land between the rivers reaching, one last time, a peak of splendor preserved in later memory. The land had died so many times. Akkad, the golden age of Hammurabi, the end Bronze Age international system, Assyria most spectacularly of all. And every time, it had risen. And now, in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, it had returned in a form of extraordinary monumental splendor, a final, dazzling flowering of a 3,000-year-old civilization. But Babylon's magnificence does not mean that its fall must repeat Assyria's. The political mechanism will be different again. But this time, the fall would not come the way you expect. This time, there would be no burning city, no annihilating army, no a short sequence of sieges and battles. This time, the celebrated imperial city would fall in the strangest, quietest way of all. The capital would pass into Persian hands without a destructive battle inside its walls, according to the Babylonian Chronicle, and it would fall to a man who came not as a destroyer, but as a liberator, a man who would end 3,000 years of Mesopotamian independence, not by erasing the civilization, but by embracing it, a man whose conquest of Babylon would be remembered, of all things, as an act of mercy. His name was Cyrus, and with him, the long, long story of Mesopotamia's deaths and resurrections was about to reach its final, and most surprising, turn. The Persian conquest complicates the word fall more than any earlier episode. A dynasty ended, an army lost, and Babylon entered a larger empire. Yet the city was not erased, its scribal traditions did not abruptly stop, and Persian rule often worked through established institutions. This was still conquest, supported by force and framed by royal propaganda. But it shows that political subordination can coexist with cultural continuity, and that a civilization may survive not by defeating the conqueror, but by becoming indispensable to the conqueror's own administration and legitimacy. Every fall in this story so far has been loud: cities in flames, walls torn down, kings dragged in chains, corpses in the rivers. The land between the rivers seemed to know only one way to end an age, and that was in fire and slaughter. The Persian takeover of Babylon, the final dynastic transition in this film, was comparatively quiet inside the capital. To understand how Babylon changed hands without a destructive siege inside the city, we have to look east, where the Achaemenid Persians had built a rapidly expanding imperial coalition on the Iranian plateau, the Persians, and their leader was a man history would call Cyrus the Great, and he was, by any measure, one of the most consequential conquerors of the ancient world, not because of how he fought, though he fought brilliantly, but because of how he ruled. Cyrus had risen from a minor kingdom, subordinate to more powerful neighbors, and in the space of a single decade, he had overturned the entire balance of power in Western Asia. He overthrew his Median overlords. He conquered the fabulously wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia. He absorbed the Greek cities of the coast and vast stretches of the Iranian highlands. His empire grew with extraordinary speed, and soon governed a territory larger than Assyria had controlled at its height. But here is what set Cyrus apart, and it is the key to everything that follows. Every great conqueror before him had ruled by imposing himself. The Assyrians ruled by terror, by flaying and deportation, and the deliberate shattering of local identities. Even the gentler empires had ruled by installing their own governors, their own language, their own gods. Cyrus did something close to the opposite. He and his successors developed a flexible imperial strategy that often preserved local elites, cults, and administrative practices. The policy was not universal benevolence. Persian kings used force, demanded tribute, punished rebellion, and appointed officials of their own. Yet they often governed through local institutions and presented themselves in languages of legitimacy familiar to the people they ruled. That flexibility helped the empire manage diversity across an enormous territory without requiring every province to become culturally Persian. Now turn to Babylon in its final days. Nebuchadnezzar was gone, and the dazzling empire he had built had passed, after some turmoil, to a strange and unpopular king named Nabonidus. And Nabonidus made a series of choices that quietly hollowed out his own throne. He was devoted, unusually, to the moon god, and he elevated that god in ways that deeply offended the powerful priesthood of Marduk, Babylon's own patron deity, the priests who were the beating heart of the city's religious and political life. Even stranger, Nabonidus spent about 10 years of his reign away from Babylon entirely, living in a distant Arabian oasis, for reasons that are still debated, leaving his son as regent in the capital. And in his long absence, the crucial religious festivals, the great New Year ceremonies that bound the king to the gods, and the gods to the cosmos could not be properly performed, to the priests of Marduk, to the traditional elites, to much of the city. This was not just neglect. It was a rupture in the sacred order of the universe. The king had abandoned his most fundamental duty. By the end, Babylon's own most powerful people were bitterly alienated from their own king. When Cyrus invaded Babylonia in 539 BC, the decisive campaign unfolded before the capital itself changed hands. The Babylonian Chronicle records a Persian victory at Opis, the capture of Sippar without battle, and the entry of Persian troops into Babylon. A later Greek account adds the dramatic image of soldiers entering after the Euphrates was lowered. But that detail is not found in the contemporary chronicle. Nabonidus was captured, and Babylon passed under Persian control without the destructive urban siege that had ended Nineveh. But the truly extraordinary part is what Cyrus did next. He did not sack Babylon. He did not burn it, or loot its temples, or deport its people, or tear down its walls. His official presentation emphasized continuity rather than exemplary destruction. He entered the city as a respectful liberator. He claimed the traditional Babylonian royal titles for himself. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate king, chosen by Marduk himself, come to restore the proper worship and the proper order that the failed Nabonidus had neglected. He honored the temples. He kept the administration running. He preserved the main institutions through which the city could continue functioning. And he left behind a document that has become genuinely famous, a clay cylinder inscribed with the official Persian account of these events, in which Cyrus presents his entry into Babylon as peaceful, welcomed, and approved by Marduk, his care for the city's well-being, and, most striking of all, a policy of restoring selected cults and returning divine images to sanctuaries from which Nabonidus had gathered them. This is the Cyrus cylinder, and modern publicity has sometimes called it an early statement of human rights, though scholars rightly caution that it was also, of course, imperial propaganda, a conqueror advertising his own generosity. Its language is that of Mesopotamian royal legitimacy, not a modern charter. Separate biblical traditions credit Cyrus with allowing Judean exiles to return and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. The cylinder itself does not name Judah. In the Hebrew tradition, this made Cyrus, a foreign Persian king, a divinely appointed liberator, remembered in Scripture with a reverence given to almost no other outsider. The conqueror of Babylon became a hero of the Bible. So here, at last, is the final fall. And notice how completely it breaks the pattern. There is no fire, there is no annihilation, there is no scattering of the people. The city is not destroyed. It is, if anything, preserved. Babylon simply becomes a wealthy, honored province of a much larger empire, keeping its temples, its scholars, its ways of life, its astronomers still charting the heavens, its scribes still pressing wedges into clay. The Neo-Babylonian dynasty ends, but Babylonian urban, cultic, and scholarly life continues. And this is the deepest and most fitting end the story could possibly have, because it takes the great theme of the whole film, the refusal to die, and reveals its final form. For 3,000 years, Mesopotamia had survived collapse after collapse by rising again from the ashes, rebuilding its empires, resurrecting its glory. But now, it discovered the ultimate survival strategy, the one hinted at long ago, when the Kassites became Babylonian. It survived through incorporation. Persian conquest ended the dynasty, but the new empire adopted and adapted Mesopotamian institutions, scholarly traditions, and forms of royal legitimacy. The Persian Empire took Babylonian administration, Babylonian astronomy, Babylonian scribal traditions, Babylonian ways of governing, and carried them forward, made them part of the administrative and intellectual life of the Achaemenid Empire, which governed an unprecedented expanse of territory. Political independence ended, while cultural transmission continued through a new imperial framework. The land between the rivers would no longer remain the independent center of a durable Mesopotamian empire. In that narrow, political sense, this was the end. The year 539 BC, the end of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty and of Mesopotamian political independence in the form described by this film. After Cyrus came his Persian successors, and after them Alexander the Great, who took Babylon in triumph and dreamed of making it the capital of his own world empire, and who died, fittingly, in Nebuchadnezzar's own palace in Babylon itself. After Alexander came his Greek successors, and then the Parthians, and then the Sasanian Persians, and then, at last, the armies of Islam. Successive imperial dynasties ruled the region for many centuries. And yet, even now, even at the end, the refusal continued in quieter and quieter forms. The old temples kept operating for centuries under Persian and Greek rule. The cuneiform script, the writing that had been born on this plain more than 3,000 years earlier, kept being used by a dwindling band of scribes and astronomers, the last of them still pressing wedges into clay in the 1st century AD, more than 3 millennia after early accountants at Uruk impressed and drew some of the earliest administrative signs. The very last datable cuneiform tablets we possess are astronomical texts, the star watchers of Babylon still doing their ancient work, while the world they had been born into faded around them, keeping one of the world's oldest writing traditions alive, right up until the moment the last of them died. The lights, in the end, did not go out in a single great fire. They dimmed, slowly, one scribe at a time, across centuries, until the last one flickered and was gone. But something had survived all of it. Something had passed through every single one of these collapses. Akkad and Ur and Babylon and Assyria and the Bronze Age darkness and the Persian conquest and all the long twilight after, and had never fully been lost. To understand what this land really was, and why its refusal to die matters to you, sitting here, thousands of years later, we have to ask one last question. Through all those deaths and resurrections, all those burning cities and fallen kings, what exactly was it that kept surviving? What was the thing that would not die? It was not the empires. Every empire fell. It was not the kings. Every king died. It was something underneath all of that, something the empires and the kings were only ever the temporary containers for. Let's look, at last, at what they were really saving. Continuity did not mean perfect preservation. Texts were lost, languages changed, rituals were reinterpreted, and later societies selected what they found useful. The survival of Mesopotamian culture was therefore not the survival of a sealed package. It was a chain of copying, translation, adaptation, argument, and rediscovery. That distinction matters. Traditions endure not because they remain untouched, but because enough people repeatedly decide that they are worth carrying into a new political and linguistic world. Every arc of this film so far has been about power, kings and empires, armies and conquests, rising and falling. But power was never really the story. Power was just the weather. It changed constantly, sometimes gently, sometimes in catastrophic storms, and the empires were like clouds, forming and dissolving and reforming above the land. The thing that actually endured was underneath the weather, and to see it, you have to stop looking at the palaces and start looking at what the palaces were built to protect, and what kept surviving even when every palace fell. Start with one of the most consequential things this civilization produced, the practice that outlasted each imperial dynasty in this story: writing. Writing is so familiar that its historical transformation can be difficult to feel. Oral societies preserve complex law, genealogy, ritual, ecological knowledge, and narrative across generations. The world before writing was not a world without memory. What writing changed was the scale, durability, comparability, and portability of records. A statement could survive beyond one speaker, be checked against another tablet, copied by an apprentice, carried to another city, or recovered after the official who ordered it had died. In late 4th millennium Uruk, that transformation emerged through practical experiments in accounting, labeling, and administration rather than through a sudden decision to create literature. The temples of Uruk controlled enormous stores of grain and herds of animals and armies of workers, and someone had to keep track of it all, and human memory was not good enough. So the administrators began pressing marks into wet clay. First simple pictures, a picture of a sheep to mean a sheep, then marks for the numbers of them. And then, over generations, something extraordinary happened. The marks became more abstract. They stopped standing for things and started standing for sounds. And once a mark could stand for a sound, you could write anything at all, any word in the language, any thought a human being could think. A system invented to count sheep became a system that could capture the entire contents of the human mind and freeze it in clay so that it could outlive the mind that thought it. This is the invention that made everything else possible, and its earliest known urban development is documented here, and it survived repeated political ruptures in this story. Empires burned, but the scribal schools kept training new scribes. Dynasties fell, but the tablets kept being copied. The Kassites adopted it. The Assyrians treasured it. The Persians used it. For more than 3,000 years, the wedge-shaped writing of Mesopotamia carried human thought across time, and it was adopted and adapted by successive states on this plane because successive institutions continued to find practical and sacred uses for it. And what did they write? Everything. That is the wonder of it. Because those clay tablets, the ones that survived by the tens of thousands, baked hard in the fires of collapsing cities, are not just dry accounts of grain and taxes, though there are mountains of those. They are the whole of human life, 4,000 years ago, preserved in astonishing intimacy. They wrote one of humanity's oldest surviving great stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh, rooted in traditions about a king whom later lists placed at early dynastic Uruk, is not just old. It remains one of ancient literature's most powerful meditations on grief and mortality. It follows a powerful, arrogant king who befriends a wild man, and loves him, and then loses him to death, and is so shattered by that loss that he sets out on a desperate journey to escape death itself, to find the secret of immortality. And at the end of that journey, he fails. He learns that death is the fate of all human beings, that immortality is not for us, and that the only thing a mortal can do is live and build and love and accept the shortness of the light. 4,000 years ago, on this plane, a human being wrestled with the exact same terror of death that keeps you awake at 3 in the morning, and wrote it down, and it survived every collapse, and you can read it today. One of humanity's oldest surviving great literary works confronts the fear of death and the challenge of living within mortal limits. Its age makes it distant. Its emotional problem makes it immediate. And in that same epic sits a detail that stops people cold: a great flood. A god who decides to wipe out humanity. A single righteous man, warned in advance, who builds a great boat, and saves his family and the animals, and rides out the deluge, and sends out birds to find dry land, and, when the waters recede, offers a sacrifice. If that sounds familiar, it should. This flood story was written down centuries before the biblical story of Noah, and the parallels are so close they cannot be coincidence. The flood myth of the ancient Near East, born on a floodplain that knew all too well what it meant to watch the waters rise and swallow whole cities, flowed down through the cultures of the region and into the Bible and into the memory of half the world. The land that kept dying and rising had, near the very beginning, told a story about the wider region dying underwater, and one boat of life surviving. Even its myths were about refusing to die. They wrote law, as we have seen, the codes of Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi, the revolutionary idea that justice should be public and written and standard rather than the whim of the powerful. They wrote medicine, texts that catalog symptoms and treatments with real clinical observation, sitting side by side with incantations against the demons they also believed caused disease. The empirical and the magical bound together exactly as they were in every early culture. They wrote astronomy, night after night of patient observation that would eventually let them predict the heavens, the ancestor of all mathematical science. They gave us the way we still count time itself, the system based on the number 60 that survives every time you look at a clock and see 60 minutes in an hour, or turn a circle through 360 degrees. Every single day of your life, you use a way of measuring time and angle that was invented by scribes on this plane more than 4,000 years ago, and that survived every collapse to reach you. And they wrote about themselves, in ways that make them suddenly, shockingly real. We know the name of one of the earliest authors in human history, whose name is attached to a substantial body of writing, and it is not a king or a general, it is a woman. Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, high priestess of the moon god, who composed hymns and poems more than 4,000 years ago and signed them, put her name and her voice and her feelings into them. The earliest named author presently known to many historians, a woman writing during the Akkadian imperial age. At an extraordinarily early point in the surviving literary record, there was Enheduanna. And through the tablets we can see the texture of ordinary lives, and it is not what you might expect. This was a society where women had real rights that many later civilizations would strip away. Women could own property, they could run businesses, they could serve as scribes and as priestesses, they could initiate divorce. They were not equal, not by any modern measure, in a rigidly hierarchical world, but they were not invisible either. And the tablets are full of their contracts and their letters and their lives. We can read marriage agreements and loan documents and court cases and schoolboy exercises, the complaints of students who hated their strict teachers, the letters of merchants far from home, the recipes for beer, which they brewed and loved and even paid workers in. We can read a wisdom text that wrestles with the oldest and hardest question of all, why the innocent suffer, a text so close in spirit to the biblical book of Job, that reading them together collapses 4,000 years into nothing. This is what they were really saving, not the empires. The empires were just the containers. What they were saving, what kept surviving every collapse, was this: the accumulated substance of a civilization, the writing, and the stories, and the law, and the science, and the mathematics, and the myths, and the memory of what it is to be a human being, alive and afraid, and in love, and doomed to die, and building anyway. That is the thing that would not die. The empires were mortal. This was, in a strange way, immortal, because it could be copied, and carried, and taught, and reborn. And it was, over and over, in every resurrection, because every new power that rose on this plane understood, even if it could not have said so, that this was the treasure, and the palaces were only the box. And here is the final turn of the whole idea, the final turn in the film's argument. When we say the civilization survived, we do not really mean it survived only for itself. We mean it survived for us. Because every one of these things, the writing, the wheel, the law codes, the 60 minutes in your hour, the flood story in your holy books, many influential forms of urban administration, the very idea of written knowledge accumulating across generations so that we do not each have to start from scratch. Much of it was developed, transformed, or preserved on this plane and then transmitted through complex routes, through repeated political changes, into Persian, Greek, and later scholarly worlds, and down the long river of history. and it is in your hands right now. You are holding a piece of ancient Mesopotamia in your mind at this very moment, in the way you read and count and tell time and imagine the past. Parts of it survived repeated collapses and, after many transformations, reached the modern world. The empires all fell, every single one of them, but the thing they were carrying never dropped. So now, at last, we can go back to the beginning, back to Nineveh, burning in the dark, back to the image we started with, the mighty city, the final fire, the fall. And we can finally understand what we are really looking at, and why the whole way we usually tell this story, the way everyone tells this story, is wrong. Because that fire was not an ending. It never was. Let's finish this. By this point, the film can make two arguments without pretending that every period followed an identical formula. The first concerns recurrent state failure. Concentrated systems can magnify shocks when food, authority, information, and force depend on the same narrow channels. The second concerns cultural endurance. Knowledge survives when it is distributed across institutions, communities, languages, and media, rather than locked inside one palace. These arguments are related, but they are not mirror images. One explains why political orders can break. The other explains why civilization can outlive them. We have watched several Mesopotamian political orders fail or transform. Akkad, Ur, the Golden Age of Babylon, the End Bronze Age international system, Assyria, most spectacularly of all. And we have watched urban and scribal life return in new political forms until it finally, quietly, flowed into the empire of Cyrus, rather than dying at all. That is a lot of collapses. And it is time to say something uncomfortable about the very word we have been using this whole time. The word is collapse. And a growing number of the scholars who actually study this, who spend their lives in the tablets and the dig sites and the climate data, have come to believe that it is one of the most misleading words we have. Here is the problem with it. When you say a civilization collapsed, you conjure a very specific image, the one this film opened with: a great fall, a final ending, lights out, forever, a society that was there one day and gone the next, wiped from the earth. It is dramatic, and it is simple, and it fits in a headline, and it fits in a few minutes of narration, and it is, in almost every real case, wrong. Pull back across the full 3,000 years, and the word collapse begins to separate into different layers. Imperial dynasties ended. Capitals were destroyed or diminished. Tax systems, armies, and provincial commands failed. Populations suffered, moved, and sometimes declined sharply. Yet other layers often continued: farming communities, temples, local cities, scribal training, stories, legal practices, and technical knowledge. Continuity was never complete, and recovery did not restore everything that had been lost. Still, the failure of a state was not automatically the disappearance of the civilization beneath it. That distinction is essential to the argument of this film. This is the great insight of modern collapse studies, and it changes everything. As one influential archaeologist has argued at length, the popular idea of collapse, the sudden and total end, is largely a myth, a story we tell because it is dramatic and morally satisfying, not because it is what the evidence shows. Another scholar put it even more bluntly, arguing that ancient states and civilizations do not really collapse at all, if by collapse we mean a complete and final end to those societies and their ways of life, because they almost never end that way. Instead, the modern researchers talk about resilience and transformation and regeneration. They point out that the interesting thing about a so-called collapse is not the falling, it is the coming back. It is what survives, and how, and why. The old obsession with the fall, they argue, blinded us to the far more important and far more common story of the recovery. And there is a reason, a slightly embarrassing reason, that we got this wrong for so long. It is partly the fault of drama itself. A burning city makes a better story than a slow reorganization. A final, total ending makes a better morality tale. Punishment for pride, the wages of decadence, than a messy, structural, half-accidental cascade of failures, followed by an unglamorous rebuild. We wanted the collapse of great civilizations to mean something, to be a lesson, a judgment, and so we told it as a clean tragedy, with a clear villain and a final curtain. And there is another reason too, a practical one. The periods after collapse, the so-called Dark Ages, are genuinely hard to study, because a society in the middle of rebuilding does not leave behind the gold and the palaces and the grand inscriptions that fill our museums. The recovery is quiet in the archaeological record. It is easy to miss, so we saw the brilliant rise and we saw the dramatic fall, and we largely missed the long, patient, world-shaping regeneration in between, which is where the real story lives. Now hold that reframing up against everything we have watched and see how it all clicks into place, because this film has really been making two arguments at once, braided together, and now we can pull them apart and see them clearly. The first argument concerns recurrent political breakdown. The answer is not a single mechanism, but a family of recurring dependencies. Mesopotamian states repeatedly relied on institutions that generated both capacity and dependency, but the balance differed from one period to another. Irrigation created surplus and supported cities and specialists. In some places and periods, poor drainage and intensive use also contributed to salinity and waterlogging. Administrative complexity created power, while also creating dependencies that could transmit failure. Empire created reach and wealth, while raising the cost of defense, succession, communication, and compliance. Interconnection created a rich international world, and interconnection also meant that a failure anywhere could cascade everywhere. The collapses did not follow one identical formula, but they repeatedly show shocks interacting with concentrated dependencies. External conquest mattered, but it usually interacted with internal conflict, fiscal pressure, environmental stress, or administrative weakness. Several shocks could reinforce one another faster than institutions could adapt. Not drought alone, invasion alone, or soil stress alone. The pattern is a convergence, a stressed political order encountering several pressures faster than it can adapt. And notice the pattern in the shocks, because it is one of the most useful patterns this ancient history reveals. The decisive factor, again and again, was rarely the shock alone. It was the mismatch between a permanent change and a system built on the assumption that things would stay the same. When aridity intensified around the end of the 3rd millennium BC, Akkadian institutions may have struggled to adjust extraction and settlement patterns to changing regional production. Where salinity and waterlogging reduced flexibility, administrators and farmers faced a slow environmental pressure that could be managed in some places but not eliminated everywhere. When Assyria faced possible drought during succession conflict and invasion, reduced agricultural flexibility may have made military recovery more difficult. The recurring vulnerability was the gap between changing conditions and institutions organized around older expectations. Drought, soil stress, and enemies were real forces, not metaphors. Their effects became more severe when political systems lacked the flexibility, resources, or legitimacy to respond. These systems were effective under familiar conditions. Their weakness appeared when several conditions changed faster than institutions and leaders could respond. That is the first argument. Political orders become vulnerable when concentrated dependencies meet changes they cannot absorb. The comparison with the present should remain cautious. Our technologies, institutions, knowledge, and global conditions are profoundly different, yet the underlying question is recognizable. Which systems do we treat as permanent simply because they have worked throughout our own lives? And how quickly could several failures reinforce one another? Mesopotamian history offers no prophecy, but it does offer disciplined skepticism toward claims of permanence. But there is the second argument, and it is the one that matters most, and it is the reason this is ultimately not a tragedy, but something closer to a hymn. The second argument is about why it kept rising, and the answer is that a civilization is not its rulers, and it is not its empires, and it is not even its cities. A civilization is the accumulated substance underneath all of that, the knowledge and the writing and the skills and the stories and the deep human capacity to build, and that substance is far, far harder to kill than any king ever imagined. You can burn every palace, you can slaughter every soldier, you can drag every ruler into exile, and as long as one scribe remembers how to write, and one farmer remembers how to work the land, and one storyteller remembers Gilgamesh, and the memory of what it means to live together in a city survives in even a handful of minds, the whole thing can be rebuilt. That is what happened here, across repeated crises. That is the refusal. That is the thing that would not die, not the empires, which all died, the substance beneath them, which did not. Collapse was not the opposite of survival. In several periods, the breakup of one political order redistributed people, texts, skills, and institutions into new settings where they could be recombined. The falling and the rising are not two different stories. They are the same story, the same heartbeat, breathing in and breathing out across 3,000 years. The land between the rivers did not survive, despite its collapses. In a strange and profound way, it survived through them, shedding its rulers like old skin, reorganizing, absorbing its conquerors, carrying its true treasure, the writing and the knowledge and the memory, forward through every fire, until it flowed at last into the whole river of human civilization and became, quietly, permanently, a part of us. So the usual story, the one everyone tells, the mighty city and the final fall, is not just incomplete, it is backwards. It stares at the fire and calls it an ending, when the fire was never the point. The point was always what came after the fire. The point was always the refusal, which means it is time, finally, to go back to Nineveh, burning in the dark, and see that fire for what it truly was. We are back where we began. Nineveh, the city without rival, the royal heart of an empire that had dominated the Near East, is going up in flames. The gates are down, the palaces are burning, the king disappears from the record, and may be dying somewhere within the destruction. From the hills, the light of it must have been visible for miles. A whole civilization's capital turned into a pillar of flame against the dark. When we first stood here, at the very start of this story, that fire meant one thing. It meant the fall, the mighty city, the final flame, the end. The tragedy we have been telling each other for as long as we have told stories. It is harder to see the fire in quite the same way now, because the history behind it has changed what the image means. Because you know too much now. You know that this fire was not the first time this land had watched its greatest power burn. You know it belonged to a sequence older than Assyria itself. You know that Akkad fell, and fell, and Babylon's golden age fell, and the end Bronze Age system fractured, and after each major rupture, urban and scribal traditions reappeared in altered political forms. You know that the fire in front of you right now, the fire consuming one of the most powerful empires the ancient Near East had known, is not an ending. It is a transfer. Because you know what is happening 300 miles to the south at this very moment. You know that the man who lit this fire, the Babylonian, is already turning his mind toward a new empire. You know that the old city on the Euphrates, the gate of the gods, is stirring, and that within a single generation it will blaze up into Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, one of the ancient world's most celebrated capitals, the Ishtar Gate, glowing blue and gold, the astronomers charting the heavens, the disputed memory of the Hanging Gardens, entering later tradition. You know that the fall of Nineveh is not the death of this civilization. It is the exact moment the torch passes from one hand to the next. And you know something the people watching Nineveh burn could never have known. You know that inside those burning palaces, buried right now under the collapsing rubble, are tens of thousands of clay tablets, the gathered knowledge of 3,000 years, and that the destruction is hardening some tablets and burying others beneath rubble, creating the conditions under which part of the library will survive, sealing them in the earth, preserving the myths and the epics and the sciences of the whole ancient world, so that 25 centuries from now, human beings will dig them out and read them and remember. The destruction is therefore part of the archive's survival, but not its whole explanation. Assyrian scholars first had to collect the texts, scribes had to copy them, clay had to endure, and excavators had to recover what remained. Preservation was a chain of decisions and accidents, not a gift produced by fire alone. That is what you are really looking at when you look at Nineveh burning. Not an ending, a heartbeat, the breathing in and the breathing out of a civilization that had learned, over 3,000 years, how to die without dying. So let's ask, one final time, the question this whole film has been built around. Not the easy one, not why did Mesopotamia fall? We have answered that one many times over, and the answer is always the same. It fell for different combinations of reasons in different periods: environmental pressure, political rivalry, succession crises, overextension, fiscal strain, migration, and war. Yet the same broad tension recurred. Institutions that concentrated power also concentrated risk. That is the why of the falling, and it is a warning, and we will come back to it. But the real question, the strange and harder one, was never why it fell. It was why it wouldn't stay dead. And now, at the end, we can answer it. It wouldn't stay dead because the thing that made it a civilization was never the part that kept dying. The empires died, the kings died, the palaces burned, but those were only ever the containers. The actual civilization, the writing, and the knowledge and the law, and the stories, and the deep human skill of building a shared life together, that was carried underneath, in the minds of scribes and farmers and storytellers and priests, and proved remarkably difficult to erase. To erase it completely would have required the simultaneous loss of texts, practices, institutions, and the communities that carried them, and that never happened. Across many periods, there were still communities who remembered how to write, how to farm the floodplain, how to build a city, how to tell the story of Gilgamesh. And as long as that was true, the whole thing could be rebuilt, and it was, again and again, until it finally flowed, whole and living, into the traditions of many civilizations that came after. That is why it refused to die, because a civilization is not a building you can burn. It is a memory you would have to erase from every human mind that carries it. And this one had spread its memory too widely, embedded it too deeply, written it down too permanently, to ever be fully erased. But even that sentence needs one final qualification. Memory does not survive by magic. It survives because people perform work that is easy to overlook. Apprentices copy signs until their hands ache. Temple households protect archives. Families continue rituals under unfamiliar rulers. Farmers preserve techniques that no royal inscription bothers to mention. Translators carry old ideas into new languages. Excavators recover objects that ancient builders never expected us to see. Mesopotamia endured through institutions, but also through countless acts of ordinary transmission. Its survival was not automatic. It was repeatedly made. And here is the part that reaches across 4,000 years and touches you directly right now. Because that memory did not just survive for the people of the ancient Near East, it survived for you. Every time you write something, so that it can outlast the moment in which it was spoken, you participate in a practice whose earliest urban forms were transformed at places such as Uruk. Every time you glance at a clock and divide the hour into 60 minutes, or turn through 360 degrees, you are counting the way Sumerian scribes counted more than 4,000 years ago. Every time you expect law to be written, knowable, and constrained by precedent rather than invented entirely in the moment, you participate in a long legal history to which the law collections of Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi belong. When you read a flood story in a holy book, when you fear death at 3 in the morning the way Gilgamesh feared it, when you live in a city at all, you are holding a piece of ancient Mesopotamia in your hands, passed to you through every single one of those collapses, carried through every fire, and the chain of transmission was never fully broken. In that limited but real sense, the act of remembering completes the chain of survival. You, watching this, are what all those scribes were saving when they copied the tablets one more time in the shadow of a falling empire. They were saving it for someone they would never meet, across a gulf of time they could not imagine, and that someone is you. But before we let this end on comfort, remember the warning, because it is the other half of the story, and it is meant for us. This civilization did not fall because its people were stupid or weak. It fell because it was complex and interconnected, and stretched to its limits, and built on assumptions about a stable world, a stable climate, reliable harvests, systems that would keep working the way they always had. And when the world changed, when climate patterns changed, when fields lost productivity, when the shocks converged, institutions sometimes failed to adapt quickly enough, while royal ideology continued to present the existing order as permanent. The people of Akkad did not know they were living in a period in which Akkadian control would soon fragment. The people of Nineveh could not know that the Assyrian capitals would fall within a few decisive years, or that organized resistance would end by 609 BC. No one ever does. That is the most sobering thing this ancient story has to teach, and it is not really about them at all. We live inside global systems of unprecedented speed, reach, and interdependence, often built on assumptions about reliable infrastructure, predictable climate ranges, and supply systems that will continue to function. The comparison should not be forced, but the people between the rivers would recognize the problem of dependence on systems too large for any one person to see. They would recognize the brilliance, and they would recognize the fragility, because they repeatedly experienced the tension between capacity and vulnerability. And yet the deepest lesson of this land is not the warning, it is the refusal. Because if the story of Mesopotamia teaches us that great civilizations are fragile, that they fall, that our towers come down, it also teaches us something far more hopeful, something we badly need to hear. It teaches us that falling is not the same as ending, that a civilization can lose everything on the surface, its empire, its cities, its rulers, its wealth, and still carry its essential self through the fire and out the other side, if it has embedded that self deeply enough, written it down permanently enough, spread it widely enough, that no single fire can consume it. The people between the rivers accumulated unusual experience in surviving political rupture, and they are also, precisely because of that, remarkably persistent adapters. Across repeated crises spanning roughly 3,000 years, they showed that the lights going out is not the end of the story. That recovery begins when knowledge, institutions, and communities survive long enough to be reorganized. So look, one last time, at Nineveh, burning in the dark. Feel the old pull of the tragedy, the mighty city, the final flame, and then let it go, because you know better now. You know that fire is not an ending. You know that even now, in the dark, 300 miles to the south, The torch is already passing to a new hand, and Babylon is about to rise into a new imperial age. You know that the destruction and burial of the library are helping preserve tablets that will carry Gilgamesh to you across 25 centuries. You know that related traditions had survived earlier ruptures and would continue under new rulers, and that its true treasure is not in the palace that is burning, but in the mines and the clay that will survive the burning. This is the story of a civilization whose states repeatedly collapsed, while its writing, knowledge, stories, and urban traditions continued to move forward, and in new forms, under new rulers, it continued. That is one way to understand the long history of ancient Mesopotamia. Not a single rise and a single fall, but a heartbeat that lasted 3,000 years. Death and rebirth, collapse and resurrection, over and over, until the very pattern of it becomes the most human story there is. We tend to want our history clean, a beginning, a middle, a tragic end. The great civilization that rose and grew proud and fell one night when the barbarians came over the walls. It is a satisfying shape. It fits in a few minutes. It gives us a villain and a moral and a final curtain. But the land between the rivers refuses that shape, the way it refused everything else. It refused to be one kingdom. It refused to stay conquered. It refused to let its knowledge die. And in the end, it refused the simplest thing we tried to impose on it, the idea that its story could ever really end. Every time we try to close the book, another chapter begins in the ashes. And maybe that is the thing worth carrying away from all of this. The thing worth remembering the next time you hear that some civilization simply collapsed and vanished. Or the next time you look at our own vast, fragile, interconnected world and feel the ground shift under it. The people between the rivers would tell you two things at once and mean both of them completely. They might warn that no political order is permanent and that complexity never abolishes vulnerability. The greater the reach of a system, the more carefully it must manage the dependencies that make that reach possible. And then they would tell you the other half, the half that took them 3,000 years and 5 collapses to prove. They would tell you that falling is not the same as ending, that the fire is not the last word, that as long as someone somewhere remembers how to write it down and tell the story and light the lamp again, what is recorded, taught, practiced, and carried by many people has a chance to survive even when institutions fail. Their states failed repeatedly, their civilization kept changing, and much of it endured. Thank you for watching. This has been the story of the civilization that refused to die. If it moved you, if it made you see that old fire differently, stay with us, because the land between the rivers has more stories than any single film could hold, and every one of them, in the end, is a story about beginning again.